long before the streets of modern cities hummed with electricity, long before empires carved their names into stone and gold. There were whispers of hidden powers tucked into the world itself, substances, simple yet extraordinary, waiting silently in forests, rivers, and underground caves, held the potential to reshape perception, mood, and thought. Imagine, if you can, a time when a leaf or root could alter reality, not just physically, but spiritually, mentally, in ways that early humans could neither fully predict nor entirely control. It was in these discoveries, often accidental, that civilizations first glimpsed the strange alchemy of nature. In marketplaces that stretched across sun-baked plains, traders carried more than spices or silks. They brought jars of powders, dried flowers, and curious resins whose effects were whispered in hushed tones. A visitor might see a merchant weighing small crystals, their colors shifting subtly in the sunlight, unaware that centuries later, scientists would name the compounds with letters and formulas. Yet here, in the dust and chatter, knowledge was intuitive, passed from one hand to another, encoded in ritual, in myth, in story. Each transaction was a subtle thread in a web of understanding that modern eyes would struggle to recognize. Shamans, their faces, painted with ochre and ash, wandered into shadowed groves where plants grew thick and strange. They had no laboratories, no books, no microscopes. Instead, they relied on observation, patience, and intuition. A route chewed before dawn might bring visions. A smoke inhaled at dusk could open a doorway between the mundane and the sacred. Such experiences were not random indulgences, but carefully preserved techniques, often guarded as sacred knowledge. The slightest error might bring illness, confusion, or worse, yet the rewards visions of guidance, communion with spirits, even glimpses of the unseen forces that shaped the world were powerful enough, to ensure these practices endured for generations. In the silent corridors of ancient temples, subtle fragrances hung in the air, traces of substances whose origins were already lost to memory. Priests and priestesses moved through these spaces, performing ceremonies that merged the tangible and the mystical. They may have understood these compounds only partially, but their effects were undeniable. Laughter, tears, ecstasy, fear, every human emotion could be summoned, amplified, or subdued. And yet, outside these sacred walls, travelers carried tales of these substances like secrets, hinting at knowledge that could elevate a king or curse a village. Libraries, once brimming with scrolls and codices, held references to compounds whose very names have been erased by time, leaving only cryptic illustrations and veiled instructions. Cave paintings, too, whisper of substances and their influence. Anthropologists often describe them as primitive art. Yet, when you look closer, you see more than depictions of hunts and animals. Symbols, geometric patterns, and recurring shapes hint at altered perception, at rituals in which color, rhythm, and scent intertwine to create profound experiences. Some lines seem to pulse beneath the stone, as though they were drawn not just with pigment, but with intent. A guide to states of consciousness that were explored long before written history began. These images are fragments of a hidden curriculum. Fragments that suggest humans were experimenting with reality itself methodically, creatively, and, at times, dangerously. Trade routes crisscrossed continents, carrying more than gold or grain. From the forests of Africa to the mountains of Asia, substances moved like silent emissaries of knowledge. Some traveled under the cover of legitimate commerce, while others were smuggled in secrecy, their worth understood only by those initiated into their mysteries. A powdered root here, a dried mushroom there, a resin imported from distant lands all held promise. And the civilizations that gained access to these materials often rose not only in wealth, but in cultural sophistication. Music, art, philosophy, even political strategies were subtly shaped by experiences induced by these substances. What seems today like indulgence or superstition was, in truth, a sophisticated form of knowledge, one that intertwined with the very foundations of human thought. Consider the royal courts of antiquity, where advisors whispered the benefits of these substances, and monarchs might partake in secret rituals to sharpen insight or soothe anxiety. It was not uncommon for a king to consult with a sage who understood the precise balance of an herbal preparation, one capable of altering dreams and perceptions. Historians have long debated the influence of such practices, but the patterns are unmistakable. Decisions made under the sway of forgotten compounds may have redirected the course of battles, treaties, and dynasties. The substances themselves were silent actors, shaping human ambition without recognition, leaving only faint echoes in the records that survived. And yet, much of this knowledge disappeared. Fires, invasions, and the inexorable passage of time claimed libraries, temples, and oral traditions alike. What survived often came distorted, repurposed into folklore or ritual, stripped of the original precision with which it was once applied. Yet, even in fragments, the power of these substances resonates. A scent, a taste, a vision can awaken something ancient, a connection to the minds and hearts of those who first unlocked these secrets. It is a reminder that our ancestors' understanding of the natural world was both practical and profound, a blend of science, art, and spirituality that modern eyes can barely trace. As night falls over the imagined streets and markets of ancient civilizations, one cannot help but wonder how much of what shaped our world is hidden in substances we have long forgotten. What lost insight lies buried in the pages of burned scrolls, in the roots still growing quietly in the earth, or in the patterns of paintings etched into stone? This is the threshold of discovery, the edge between the world as we know it and the hidden forces that once guided human thought and culture. Step closer, and the shadows of the past grow alive, revealing not only the substances themselves, but the mysteries they held and perhaps still hold the power to transform perception, and with it, understanding itself in this forgotten realm. Every plant, every mineral, every compound is a key to stories untold. They speak of experimentation and caution, of pleasure and fear, of reverence and danger. They remind us that history is rarely straightforward. It is layered, textured, and sometimes hidden beneath the ordinary. The journey through these lost substances is a journey through human imagination. Curiosity encouraged the quiet, persistent search for meaning and mastery over the mind, the body, and the unseen. And as we trace the paths of these ancient discoveries, find ourselves poised to uncover not just history, but the subtle truths of our own perceptions. Under the dust of forgotten temples and the cracked tablets of lost languages, there lies a story that history has only whispered, the story of substances that changed not only the human mind, but the direction of civilization itself. Before the first kings of Sumer carved laws into stone, before Egypt built its stairways to eternity, people already knew of powders, roots, and brews that could open doors unseen by ordinary sight. They were not called drugs then, they were keys, and in the hands of priests and rulers, they were tools of both revelation and rule. The Sumerians, around 5,000 years ago, left behind tablets describing a plant of joy. Scholars debate its nature, perhaps opium, perhaps something now lost to us, but what mattered was not the chemistry. It was the experience. In the temple cities along the Euphrates, the priests would grind this sacred plant, mix it with wine, and drink in silence. The world would soften. The boundaries between mortal and divine would blur, and when they spoke afterward, their words carried the weight of prophecy. To the people, these priests had touched the realm of gods. To the priests themselves, they had found a language beyond reason, one that gave them power over those who still lived in daylight across the sands of Egypt. Similar rites unfolded in hidden chambers beneath the temples of Hathor and Thoth. Their incense was more than fragrance. The smoke contained resins from far lands, blue lotus, henbane, mandrake. These were the perfumes of altered consciousness, the breath of the gods themselves. When pharaohs sought counsel before war, they did not turn to scribes or soldiers. They turned to the temple keepers who inhaled the sacred smoke until visions flickered before their eyes. From those visions came decrees, edicts, divine orders. To question them was to defy heaven. It is easy from the modern world to see these rituals as superstition. Yet, beneath the gold and myth, there was understanding. These ancient minds knew that power did not always come from strength, but from perception, from shaping what others believed was real. When the priest entered trance and declared that the Nile would rise or the enemies would fall, the people did not see a man under influence. They saw a conduit of divine will. The substance had done its work in early China. The Emperor Shennong, the legendary divine farmer, was said to have tasted hundreds of plants to learn their properties. Some healed, others revealed. Among the Taoist adepts who followed centuries later, certain elixirs were said to grant glimpses of immortality. Mercury, cinnabar, and the elusive mushrooms of the spirit world appeared in their alchemical texts. Many of these seekers died from their experiments, yet others spoke of journeys beyond the body, seeing patterns behind the world's illusion. These accounts wove together medicine, mysticism, and a dangerous pursuit of transcendence. Behind the shimmering myths of these early civilizations lay a darker undercurrent. Substances that brought visions could also bring obedience. When rulers learned that a shared drink or incense could calm a restless crowd or induce awe, the rituals took on a political edge. In the temple of Inanna, where priestesses danced through the night, the air itself was a haze of intoxicating fragrance. The music pulsed, the chants rose, and the participants felt transported. But it was not only ecstasy, it was conditioning. Each ceremony reminded them who held the keys to paradise. Whispers of secret cults thread through these ancient stories like shadows behind torchlight. In Greece, long after Sumer had fallen, initiates of the Eleusinian mysteries drank a potion called kikian, a mixture historians suspect contained ergot, a fungus with hallucinogenic properties. Those who drank it spoke of dying before death, of seeing eternity, of never fearing again. The details were forbidden to reveal, punishable by death, perhaps because what they saw was not meant for common eyes, or perhaps because those in power knew that revelation, once shared too freely, dissolves control. Even in Egypt, certain royal cults practiced what scholars now call guided visions. The chosen few were led through tunnels under the temples, their senses softened by opium or lotus wine. They would awaken in chambers painted with stars, believing they had crossed into the afterlife and returned. Their loyalty afterward was absolute. To them, the king was no longer mortal. He had given them a glimpse of eternity. It is said that truth hides best where belief is strongest. The scribes wrote of divine communion, of healing herbs, of holy incense. What they did not write, or perhaps what was later erased, was how these experiences bound people together in invisible chains. When the mind believes it has touched the divine, it will serve without question. Fragments of clay tablets, half-raised hieroglyphs, obscure Chinese manuscripts, they all point to a world where consciousness itself was territory to be ruled. The line between medicine, magic, and manipulation was not yet drawn. Every sip, every breath, every crushed petal carried both promise and peril. Those who knew how to use them became the architects of early civilization, their influence hidden beneath layers of myth and ritual. Perhaps this is why so many records were lost, candles buried, and recipes forbidden. Some knowledge was never meant to survive the ages. Or perhaps it survives precisely because it still whispers to us in our curiosity. our longing to know what lies beyond the veil of ordinary perception. As centuries passed, the sacred and the forbidden began to separate. What had once been ritual slowly became medicine, trade, and later, crime. Yet the same question lingered, passing from one empire to the next like a secret flame. Who truly controls the gateways of the mind? The next chapter of this story would unfold not in temples or caves, but in courts and apothecaries, as medieval scholars, alchemists, and wanderers rediscovered those ancient substances, each believing they could master them without being mastered in return. In the shimmering courts of the ancient world, where power was measured in gold and silence, there existed another kind of treasure, one never recorded in royal ledgers, yet guarded more fiercely than crowns. It came not as jewels or steel, but as powder, potion, smoke. Its touch was subtle, its promise immense, for those who ruled. These substances offered something no army could deliver, a way to see beyond the visible, to taste destiny before it arrived. What if the fate of empires, whispered in torchlit chambers, was not decided by generals or gods, but by a secret powder in the hands of kings? In Babylon, legend tells of a royal advisor who never slept. His eyes, it was said, saw through dreams. The king trusted him above all others, for he claimed to read omens in the patterns of smoke rising from his nightly incense. That incense, brought from distant mountains, was no ordinary blend. Its resins were steeped in narcotic flowers and rare oils known only to temple healers. As the night deepened, the advisor would inhale its heavy fragrance and fall into trance, uttering counsel that changed the direction of wars. Whether it was true vision or delusion, no one dared ask. What mattered was that Babylon's rulers believed, and belief itself could move empires far to the west. Egypt's pharaohs maintained their own secret supply. Within the inner chambers of their palaces, sealed from the public eye, lay small alabaster jars containing blue lotus extract, known to open the gates of ecstasy and dream. The pharaoh's physicians guarded it as both medicine and sacrament. It soothed pain, eased fear, and in larger doses carried the user into what they called the luminous field. During moments of crisis, famine, rebellion, omens of divine displeasure, pharaohs turned inward through the lotus. They emerged with revelations that would shape the kingdom's fate. Visions of floods foretold, the decrees of divine mercy or vengeance. Some said the gods spoke through the lotus. Others whispered that the pharaohs saw only the depths of their own minds, reflected back, and mistook it for prophecy. The exclusivity of these substances was itself a form of control. In every great court, the ritual of consumption was hidden behind ceremony. The common soldier might drink fermented ale or chew simple herbs, but the royal mixtures were blended in secret, often by the ruler's most trusted attendants, or, in darker times, by their enemies. A single draught could inspire radiant confidence, or send the mind spiraling into madness. Monarchs learned to fear their own chalices. Some believed their rivals' apothecaries could poison not the body, but the soul, twist and thought itself into weakness. When Alexander of Macedon conquered Egypt and Persia, his fascination with the mysteries of the East grew. Ancient accounts describe him drinking a dark wine infused with unknown Eastern plants before his prophetic dreams, dreams that drove him ever onward, convinced of his divine mission. His generals recorded that he awoke one night, trembling after a vision of fire consuming the world. Days later, he ordered the burning of Persepolis. Whether the dream guided him, or whether the potion merely unlocked the storms within his own ambition, no one could say. Yet, from that moment, even his closest companions whispered that Alexander was no longer entirely mortal, that something else had entered his mind. In China's imperial palaces, emperors employed court alchemists to prepare powders of immortality. These elixirs shimmered with mercury, jade dust, and hallucinogenic herbs gathered from the mountains. the emperors consumed them with trembling devotion, believing that enlightenment and eternal life awaited on the other side of their visions. Many died young, poisoned by their pursuit. Yet their successors continued the ritual, certain that the secret to ruling heaven and earth lay within a single shimmering draught. To command men, they reasoned, one must first command one's own spirit, even if the journey shattered the mind along the way. The Persians, too, possessed their hidden potions. Among them was halma, the sacred drink of revelation, used by priests and kings alike. Its effects were said to bring courage, clarity, and visions of cosmic order. Before great battles, the monarch and his chosen warriors would drink together under the stars. To onlookers, it was a religious rite, but to those who partook, it was more a transformation. The liquid's warmth spread like fire through their blood, and fear itself seemed to vanish. Victories followed. The substance became a symbol of divine favor, its recipe guarded as state secret. Every empire that rose in the ancient world seemed to have its own key to the unseen. The Romans imported opium and exotic resins from the East, burning them in the homes of senators and generals. The incense clouds drifted through their villas like silent conspirators. In the shadow of marble pillars, they debated the fate of nations, while their minds floated between lucidity and trance. Some historians would later call their excess decadence. Others might say it was something more deliberate, a ritual to blur the harsh lines of ambition and conscience in medieval Arabia. Stories spread of a caliph who ruled by vision rather than decree. Each night he inhaled from a golden censer filled with a mixture of saffron, musk, and a mysterious black resin. His attendants claimed that, under its influence, the caliph could see distant lands as if from above. He spoke of ships before they reached his ports, of rebellions before the first swords were drawn. His counselors feared and revered him, unsure whether he was truly blessed, or slowly descending into divine madness. The use of such substances was not always spiritual. Sometimes it was coldly political. In certain courts, rulers provided small doses to their closest advisors to heighten loyalty, to create shared visions that bound them in secrecy. Those who shared the experience believed themselves chosen, elevated above ordinary men. To question the source of their insight would be to admit that the divine had been replaced by chemistry, so they protected the illusion. And yet, not all kings were masters of these forces. Some became their victims. Chronicles from early India speak of monarchs who turned to soma, the sacred elixir of gods and poets, seeking inspiration for conquest. Many found enlightenment, others paranoia. One ruler ordered his palace walls torn down after a vision convinced him that his courtiers were conspiring within them. Another wandered into the desert, claiming he had glimpsed the face of eternity and could no longer bear mortal sight. Power, its purest form, has always fed on mystery. And what could be more mysterious than the power to alter the mind itself, to experience reality differently from those one governs, to see signs and patterns invisible to others, is to believe oneself chosen by fate. That belief can forge empires. It can also destroy them. Throughout history, these powders and potions were more than indulgence. They were instruments of divine theater, shaping how rulers saw themselves and how others saw them. Each dose was a negotiation between vision and delusion, enlightenment and control. The courtiers who supplied them were not mere servants, but gatekeepers of perception, and sometimes quiet manipulators of destiny. As the ancient world turned toward empire and trade, these royal secrets began to slip beyond palace walls. Merchants carried strange resins westward. Sailors traded lotus and opium for silver. Hands whispers spread of rulers who owed their power not to bloodlines, but to what burned in their censers. The age of kings and priests was giving way to something broader, a world where the substances of divinity would become the commodities of men. It began with caravans moving under starlit skies, lines of camels swaying through deserts, their loads wrapped in silence and guarded by men who never spoke of their cargo. The traders claimed they carried spices, perfumes, and rare incense for kings and temples. But hidden among the bales were powders and resins whose true value could not be measured in gold. These were the mine's treasures, substances so coveted that entire routes were built to feed their demand. What started as temple ritual became the quiet heartbeat of global trade, shaping economies, alliances, and betrayals that stretched across continents. From the river valleys of Mesopotamia, the first merchants sailed eastward toward the Indus and west toward the Levant, carrying with them small jars of opium, lotus resin, and fragrant oils. Their trade was not merely material, it was spiritual. The same incense that filled Babylon's temples soon drifted through the sanctuaries of Egypt, the shrines of Greece, and the palaces of Persia. Wherever it traveled, it carried whispers of altered states, of communion with unseen worlds. Each culture reinterpreted its magic. Some called it medicine, others revelation. But beneath those names, the substance itself remained the same, a catalyst for power and belief. As the Silk Road opened, the traffic of consciousness grew. Silk and gold may have dazzled travelers' eyes, but in the shadows of the caravans moved smaller, more potent cargoes. Dried petals of blue lotus from the Nile, crumbled cakes of opium from Thebes, crystalline powders distilled in Chinese apothecaries from mushrooms and minerals. Even in the earliest records of Chinese merchants, there are mentions of dream dust, traded discreetly, never taxed, always requested by name. Along the route from Xi'an to Samarkand, one could trace its invisible trail through letters written in code, using the language of perfume and spice to conceal forbidden dealings. In the ports of the Mediterranean, ships from the east began to arrive with cargo that changed not just economies, but destinies. The Greeks, already familiar with ritual intoxication, imported strange blends of herbs said to bring clarity of vision. The Romans followed, using imported opium to numb the bodies of soldiers and the hearts of rulers. Soon, these substances were no longer sacred. They became tools to soothe pain, to inspire courage, to dull conscience. Empires learned that control of such trade meant control of both body and mind. As centuries passed, trade routes grew tangled with secrecy. Pirates learned that a small chest of certain powders could be worth more than a ship's weight in silver. Spies trafficked in vials and tinctures instead of letters, sending gifts that clouded judgment or whispered inspiration. There are accounts, half legend, half truth, of envoys who brought foreign rulers peace offerings laced with rare extracts, designed not to kill, but to persuade. Treaties were signed under the haze of substances meant to soften suspicion, to make surrender feel like revelation. The medieval world saw the birth of what could only be called the first black market of consciousness. In Venice, apothecaries hid secret ingredients behind coded symbols. Powder of paradise, they called it, or oil of the prophet's tears. Buyers came from Spain, France, and the Ottoman lands, each seeking something slightly different, a cure, an escape, a vision. Yet, in every transaction, there was an unspoken understanding. What was purchased was not a product, but a door. And every door came at a price. Wars had been fought for salt, gold, and land. But what if some wars were also fought for control over these invisible substances? Some historians point to the long, bloody rivalry between Venice and the Mamluks, not only as a struggle for trade routes, but for monopoly over opium and incense flowing from Egypt to Europe. In the letters of Venetian merchants, hidden beneath formal greetings, lie cryptic phrases about cargo of sleep and the blue wine, high in the margins of royal decrees. Faint notes in cipher hint that certain kings financed expeditions not for spices, but for powders said to grant divine favor in battle. There are darker stories still, tales of generals whose armies marched under strange influences. During one forgotten siege in Central Asia, the defending soldiers were set to fight without rest for 3 days. Eyes glazed, fueled by a potion mixed from local poppies and crushed leaves. Their courage bordered on madness. The invaders, seeing them fall only to rise again, spoke of demons. Yet, behind the myth was a simple truth. Chemistry had entered the battlefield. From then on, rulers sought not just stronger swords, but stronger minds, or at least minds unburdened by fear. By the age of exploration, the world had become a web of secret exchanges. European sailors brought back from Asia not only spices and silk, but vials labeled in cryptic tongues. Missionaries in China sent letters to Rome describing herbs that grant heavenly tranquility. In the ports of Lisbon and Amsterdam, traders carried small satchels marked with symbols of the moon and serpents, signs known only to the initiated. The global economy was beginning to turn on invisible axes, driven by substances that few dared name openly. Even the great powers of diplomacy felt their pull. There are records discreetly omitted from official chronicles of banquets where envoys were offered wines laced with subtle extracts meant to relax suspicion or kindle wonder. One French ambassador, writing privately in 1664, confessed that after tasting an oriental cordial, he felt as if truths previously hidden now shone in all things. He agreed to a treaty that, the next day, he could barely recall signing. Whether it was enchantment or manipulation, no historian can prove. But the outcome of that single night altered the balance of European alliances for decades, as centuries wore on. These substances were refined, extracted, and disguised. Secret laboratories appeared in monasteries and noble estates, where alchemists sought to isolate the divine principle within plants. In coded manuscripts, they referred to their discoveries as angelic dust or elixir of inner light. Some believed they were purifying the soul. Others knew they were manufacturing influence. In the courts of kings, such mixtures were administered not to heal, but to persuade. The line between diplomacy and sorcery blurred, till neither word could fully describe what was happening behind closed doors. By the dawn of the modern age, entire economies had quietly rearranged themselves around the appetite for these dream-born substances. Wars were fought under the banners of trade and faith, but their true engines were addiction and desire. Kingdoms that controlled the flow of opium, tea, and tobacco became global powers. Those that resisted were conquered or corrupted. What had begun as holy ritual had become the bloodstream of empire. Yet, the most haunting truth is how invisible this influence remains. In every age, rulers and merchants believed they were the masters of trade, but perhaps it was the substances themselves, their allure, their promise of transcendence, that steered history from behind the curtain. Could a single powder, carried quietly across continents, have reshaped the destiny of nations? The evidence lies not in written law, but in the gaps between it, in the altered decisions, the forgotten treaties, the dreams that turned into conquest. The story now turns toward those very substances, the few that left the deepest mark, that continue to echo through history like a hidden heartbeat. For within their chemistry lies the memory of every civilization that sought power, not from the sword, but from the mind itself. It began, as many great discoveries do, with an accident, a flicker of curiosity in a forgotten corner of the ancient world. In the crumbling ruins of what is now southern Anatolia, archaeologists uncovered clay vessels sealed with pitch, their insides coated with a residue no one could immediately identify. When analyzed centuries later under the sterile light of a modern laboratory, that residue revealed traces of an unknown alkaloid, neither opium nor any plant compound known to antiquity. But carved along the vessel's rim was a symbol scholars recognized, a spiral within a circle, the ancient mark for transformation. It was the first whisper of a lost substance, one that once passed quietly from hand to hand, from temple to throne, altering minds and empires alike. In the oldest surviving tablets from Sumer and Akkad, there are scattered references to a potion called Nisaru, the breath that dreams. It was said to be distilled from a rare root that bloomed only once every 7 years, its petals vanishing at dawn. Those who consumed its extract claimed to see paths of fire above the earth, visions that granted them knowledge of events yet to come. Most scholars dismiss these as metaphors, poetic exaggerations meant to glorify divine kingship. Yet buried deep within one cuneiform fragment is a recipe written in riddles. Heat the heart of stone with the tears of heaven until the earth sings. When translated by chemists centuries later, the instructions described a primitive form of distillation, the first known attempt at isolating a psychoactive essence that legends say. The first to master this process was a nameless alchemist serving under the priest-king of Lagash. His workshop, according to myth, was carved into the walls of a river gorge, hidden from the sun. There he tended jars of clay, sealed with wax and wrapped in linen, each containing fragments of root steeped in oil. Over time, he discovered that exposure to certain minerals caused the mixture to change its color, darkening to a deep blue. Its scent sharp as lightning before rain. When the extract was consumed, the alchemist wrote, "The stars bend near the earth, and the heart grows larger than the sky." For this discovery, he was both rewarded and condemned. The king ordered the potion preserved for royal use alone, and decreed that any who made it, without permission, would be buried alive. Centuries later, Egyptian texts would speak of a similar substance known only as esayamen, that which opens the hidden eye. Unlike the sacred lotus or the opium poppy, saman was not a plant to be harvested in fields, but a secret compound to be refined in the dark. The priests of Thoth guarded its formula as the highest mystery, inscribing its ingredients in symbols that no outsider could read. One papyrus fragment describes a ritual in which a mixture of powdered stone, honey, and an unnamed resin was heated until it whispered. The resulting vapor was inhaled during ceremonies meant to summon divine knowledge. Those who participated often emerged, changed, some enlightened, others broken. A single line in faded ink warns, "Too long in the smoke, and the soul forgets its way home." From Egypt, the secret seems to have drifted eastward, carried by merchants and mystics into Persia, where it became the basis for what Zoroastrian scholars called the mirror elixir. Here, the process grew more sophisticated. Alchemists experimented with distillation using copper and glass, refining the substance into crystalline form. They believed that each crystal held a reflection of the universe, a microcosm of creation itself. Consumed in ritual, it granted what they call Vahisht Vaksh, or the perfect sight. Some accounts describe kings consulting these alchemists before war, inhaling the vapors of the elixir, and claiming to see entire campaigns unfold before a single arrow was loosed. Victories followed that seemed too precise to be coincidence, but it was in ancient Greece that the elixir acquired its modern myth. Greek physicians traveling through Persia brought back tales of a shimmering blue powder that could dissolve the boundaries between waking and dream. Hippocratic texts make veiled mention of a divine draught that reveals the harmony of opposites, while later Hellenistic scholars called it pharmakon theon, the god drug. Within secret philosophical circles, initiates used it to explore the limits of reason. Some claimed it allowed them to glimpse the structure of reality itself, a lattice of thought and matter. Others, unprepared, were driven to madness, believing they had spoken with the dead. The earliest known written record that clearly describes this elixir dates to the 2nd century BCE. In a Greek manuscript preserved in the ruins of Alexandria, an anonymous scribe details a compound derived from the root that bleeds blue when cut. The recipe required exposure to moonlight, copper filings, and the ashes of myrrh. The resulting powder was to be dissolved in wine and consumed in solitude. The author warns that no mirror should stand before the drinker, for the eyes will not know themselves. This text vanished for nearly 2,000 years before fragments resurfaced in an antiquarian's collection in Venice, smuggled out of Egypt during the Ottoman era. Modern analysis of these fragments found that the blue residue contained traces of alkaloids now known to affect serotonin pathways, compounds capable of inducing vivid visual and auditory hallucinations. In other words, the ancient recipe worked. What astonished researchers was not merely the chemistry, but the precision of the ancient method, the temperature ranges, the mineral catalysts, the emphasis on purification. These were not crude experimenters. They were early scientists cloaked in priestly robes, guided by intuition that would not be rediscovered until modern pharmacology. Across cultures, the elixir took on different names, but its essence remained unchanged. In India, Vedic hymns may have preserved echoes of it under the name Soma, though what was once divine nectar became mythic metaphor. In China, Taoist alchemists spoke of a blue spirit powder said to unlock the memory of past lives. Everywhere it appeared, the same pattern emerged: enlightenment followed by secrecy, revelation followed by suppression. The substance was too powerful, too unpredictable, too dangerous to share widely. Those who learned to make it gained insight that unsettled the hierarchies of their time: priests who questioned gods, kings who saw through crowns. And so the knowledge was buried, hidden in coded scrolls and whispered through initiatory cults that claimed descent from the first discoverer in later centuries. When empires rose and fell, the memory of the elixir lingered like smoke. Jews dismissed it as legend, a poetic metaphor for divine inspiration. Yet fragments continued to appear in Arabic manuscripts, describing the blue fire that sings, in medieval grimoires that warned of the powder of mirrored dreams. Each reference pointed back to the same lineage, the same forgotten chemistry, the same secret that haunted the edges of human history. Who first unlocked it? The priest, the alchemist, or some nameless wanderer who crushed a root by moonlight, may never be known. But their discovery did not vanish. It only retreated, waiting for minds curious enough to find it again. And those who did would not merely inherit a drug, they would inherit a burden to see too much, too soon, to never again trust the ordinary world. The story now turns toward those early inheritors, the scholars, rulers, and visionaries, who dared to refine the forgotten elixir, believing they could control what their ancestors had barely survived. In the centuries that followed its discovery, the forgotten elixir moved like a phantom through the corridors of power and prayer. It began quietly within the dim interiors of temples and libraries, where only the most trusted acolytes were permitted to approach the sealed jars. What had once been the secret of a single alchemist now became the obsession of an age. Every civilization that touched it seemed to rediscover the same paradox, that enlightenment and ruin often shared the same cup. In the temples of Egypt, high priests began to use the elixir not only for divine communion, but as a test of worthiness. Initiates were brought into candlelit chambers, the air heavy with incense and chant. There, the elixir was mixed into a dark wine and offered from a vessel inscribed with symbols of rebirth. The drinkers were told they would see their true selves. Some did. Others collapsed into seizures or spoke in tongues, their visions incomprehensible. Those who survived described landscapes of light and shadow, cities made of sound, and voices that spoke from the stars. The priests recorded their accounts meticulously, yet every record ends the same way, with silence, as if the scribes could not bring themselves to write what came next. In Greece, philosophers of the mystery schools took interest in the substance after rumors reached the Mediterranean through traders and scholars returning from the East. They renamed it Etherian, the breath of the divine. Then secluded villas on the Aegean islands. Small circles of thinkers and nobles gathered under moonlight to consume the powdered elixir dissolved in honeyed wine. Among them, it is said, was a disciple of Plato who claimed to have glimpsed the geometry of existence itself, a vision that convinced him the soul was not bound to time. But as his devotion deepened, so too did his distance from the world. He began to speak in riddles, retreating from his students, eventually vanishing into the mountains with a single vial of blue dust. Across Persia, the elixir took on a different life. Court physicians used it as medicine, claiming it could cure melancholy, paralysis, even blindness. When inhaled in precise measure, patients reported vivid dreams that revealed hidden causes of their illnesses. A few were healed. Others awoke screaming, unable to distinguish dream from waking life. Yet the successes were enough to earn the elixir a place in royal medicine. Kings sought it for strength and clarity. Generals took it before battle, believing it heightened their perception of fate. Over time, doses grew stronger. Physicians noticed that those who used it too often developed trembling hands and unquiet minds. Still, none dared forbid it. The elixir was the privilege of power, and power has always believed itself immune to consequence. In India, certain mystics incorporated it into ascetic rituals, inhaling its vapors during meditation. Ali described, "The sensation has a lifting of the veil, the dissolution of self into pure awareness." Their hymns speak of floating cities and rivers of light, experiences nearly identical to those recorded millennia earlier in Sumerian texts. Some called it the true soma, the divine drink, lost to history. But where the mystics saw revelation, the rulers saw opportunity. Temples that once offered the elixir only to initiates began selling it discreetly to nobles seeking visions of destiny. The boundary between sacred and profane blurred, and the powder that once connected humans to the divine became another currency in the marketplace of desire. In China's early dynasties, Taoist alchemists refined their own version of the substance, which they called Tian Land, heaven's orchid. They believed it could free the soul from the body and grant immortality. Those who consumed it reported journeys through celestial palaces, meetings with luminous beings, and insights into the nature of existence. But there was a cost. Some adepts grew dependent, their bodies wasting, even as their minds soared. Imperial records quietly note an epidemic of dream sickness among monks and scholars, a polite phrase for the same ailment that had haunted priests and philosophers across continents. Still, the emperor's court demanded the elixir for council and ceremony. The alchemists continued their experiments, convinced that perfection lay only one refinement away. By the early centuries of the Common Era, the elixir had become the whispered secret of the elite. Its trade moved through hidden channels, from temple apothecaries to royal physicians, from scholars' dens to the back rooms of merchants' guilds. It was never written of openly. Instead, its presence can be traced through euphemisms: the blue ink, the silent wine, the philosopher's dew. Recipes were encoded in manuscripts on astronomy or theology, disguised as metaphors for celestial conjunctions. Each formula contained the same refrain, a warning in the margins: too deep, canned, you will not return. There were those who tried to regulate its use. In Rome, a decree forbade the import of blue crystalline powders of Eastern origin, claiming they caused madness, ecstasy, and treasonous visions. Yet, within a generation, senators were rumored to keep private stocks. Some claimed the emperor himself used it before addressing the Senate, emerging from his chambers, radiant and calm, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. Whether true or not, the legend itself was power. It gave the ruler an aura of divine insight, the same illusion that had served pharaohs and kings before him. But the more it spread, the more it corrupted. What began as ritual enlightenment became intoxication. Those who once sought revelation began to chase the visions themselves, mistaking them for truth. Temples turned into dens of quiet dependence. Wealthy patrons paid for nightly ceremonies in which the elixir was burned as incense, filling halls with the scent of thunder and earth. Participants lay motionless, dreaming aloud, their murmured prophecies recorded by scribes. The words they spoke were sometimes profound, sometimes terrifying, and always ambiguous enough to justify any action. Armies marched, treaties were signed, and dynasties fell on the strength of visions born from smoke. Hidden among the legitimate users were others, smugglers and charlatans who learned to mimic the elixir's effects with dangerous substitutes. Some mixed it with toxins to stretch the supply. Others sold impure versions that drove men mad. The true formula became rarer, its keepers more secretive. Guilds formed across continents, swearing oaths to protect their knowledge. They passed their recipes from master to apprentice through code and initiation, calling themselves the keepers of the mirror. It was said that every major court in the old world had one such keeper, an unseen advisor, who provided both revelation and remedy, truth and poison. By the dawn of the medieval era, the elixir had vanished from public record, but not from practice. Its influence lived on in symbols, the blue serpent coiled around the chalice, the moon drawn within a circle, the spiral of awakening. To the common eye, these were ornaments of faith. To those who knew, there were signposts marking a hidden lineage stretching back to the first alchemist in his river cavern. The elixir had become a ghost, haunting the edges of religion, medicine, and power. What truths were revealed through its shimmering visions, and what dangers hidden beneath their beauty? Those who sought its light rarely found peace. Yet the promise of seeing beyond, of touching the divine for even a moment, proved irresistible. The next chapter would belong to those who tried to harness that promise, not for worship, but for mastery, the scholars, the kings, and the secret orders who believed they could control the elixir's power without losing themselves to it. It began with whispers carried on the wind of a blue powder, so rare that merchants would trade their lives for a handful. By the time the forgotten elixir left its birthplace, the world had already begun to change around it. Empires hungered not only for gold and silk, but for what could not be seen: insight, inspiration, control. And in the dim corners of ancient ports, among the smoke of burning resins and the cries of sailors, small clay jars changed hands with the secrecy of stolen gods, from the harbors of the Red Sea to the caravan cities of Persia. The elixir traveled under false names. To some, it was sky dust. To others, blue fire. Its transporters used ledgers coated in fragrance and spice myrrh, cinnamon, frankincense, where each scent represented not a perfume, but a measure of the elixir itself. It moved quietly through the arteries of trade, hidden within incense shipments bound for temples, or within amphorae of oil destined for royal kitchens. Those who moved it learned to speak in symbols. A serpent marked on parchment meant purity. A crescent moon meant danger. These couriers knew that discovery meant execution. 4 rulers guarded their access to the elixir as they guarded their crowns. Caravans carrying the substance crossed deserts by night, their camels cloaked in silence, their guides swearing blood oaths never to reveal the roots. The substance's weight was small, but its value immense. A single ounce could buy a ship, a town, or a man's loyalty. Smugglers wrapped the jars in layers of silk and sealed them in lead, believing that even the air could betray them. Many caravans vanished, lost to storms or raiders, but enough survived to ensure that the elixir spread like rumor, unpredictable, unstoppable. By the first millennium BCE, traces of its presence appeared in unexpected places, in the ritual bowls of Phoenician priests, in the ink of Assyrian scribes, even in the offerings buried beneath the temples of Crete. Its effects fascinated and frightened those who encountered it. Some used it to enter trance and speak with gods. Others ground it into pigments, believing its color carried spiritual power. The artists of Nassau's painted walls that seemed to glow from within, their blues too vivid for natural dye. Historians would later puzzle over the source of that hue. Perhaps it was merely mineral. Or perhaps it was memory made visible, the mark of a substance that blurred the line between art and vision. As seafaring nations grew bold, the elixir's reach extended across oceans. Phoenician traders carried it westward to Carthage, where it became the secret of oracles and healers. There, a single priestess was said to inhale its vapors before foretelling storms and wars. Her predictions so accurate that generals began to consult her before every campaign. In one account, she warned that the city would burn by its own flame. Years later, as Rome's legions surrounded Carthage, her prophecy came true. Whether she foresaw the future or shaped it through belief, none could say. Rome soon learned the elixir's worth. Their merchants brought it from Alexandria under the guise of medicine, calling it pulvis callistis, the celestial powder. Apothecaries sold it discreetly to senators and nobles who sought clarity of mind or escape from conscience. Its import became so lucrative that rival families fought not for land, but for monopoly over its trade. Beneath the marble grandeur of the empire, secret shipments moved through underground vaults, guarded by mercenaries, bound by silence. The Senate, unable to control it, chose instead to tax it, a quiet acknowledgement that some powers could not be banned, only managed. But beyond the reach of Rome, the seas told darker stories. In the Indian Ocean, Arab and Indian sailors exchanged small glass vials at night, their transactions lit only by moonlight. Pirates stalked at these routes, knowing that a single captured vessel could yield wealth beyond imagining. Whole fleets were funded by the profits of smuggled elixir, their captains living and dying by secrets written in invisible ink. In the ports of Oman and Aden, local rulers turned a blind eye, taking their payment not in gold, but in powder, believing it granted them the insight to govern wisely. Some said they saw too much. The Chinese, always attentive to the movements of foreign merchants, learned of the substance through the Silk Road. The first jars arrived during the Han Dynasty, labeled as blue orchid salt. Imperial scholars studied it under the guise of chemistry, while court mystics tested its effects in elaborate ceremonies. A few emperors grew obsessed. The court annals speak of the azure mist that surrounded certain emperors' chambers, and of long nights spent in solitude, chasing visions of immortality. When their decisions became erratic, wars launched without cause. Decrees written in riddles, the ministers whispered of poison. Yet no one dared to name it. As global networks expanded, so too did the shadow empires built upon the elixir's trade. Merchant guilds in Alexandria and Antioch formed secret alliances with ship captains, smugglers, and spies. Their communications used symbols burned into wax seals: a coiled serpent for purity, a star for safe passage, a broken circle for betrayal. Each symbol carried meaning known only to the initiated. Through these coded messages, routes were established that stretched from the Nile to the North Sea, linking monasteries, ports, and caravanserais in an invisible chain. Even the rise of new faiths could not erase it. While temples burned and idols fell, the elixir survived within the rituals of mystic sects. In early Christian and Gnostic communities, fragments of hymns speak of the blue flame within, a metaphor that some scholars now suspect referred to the same ancient compound. The substance was always hidden in language, a mystery disguised as revelation by the medieval era. Its trade had become entangled with empire. Venice, master of the Mediterranean, guarded the routes from Egypt and the Levant with ruthless secrecy. In their warehouses, beneath sacks of pepper and cinnamon, lay carefully sealed flasks marked with crescent sigils. Venetian records described naval skirmishes in which ships carrying precious chemical matter were captured or destroyed, though the cargo's nature was never named. In reality, these were battles not for spice, but for the elixir that made kings dream and rulers yield. When Portuguese explorers rounded Africa, they carried the knowledge with them, spreading it to new continents. In the jungles of South America and the islands of the Pacific, They found plants with similar properties, new ingredients to feed an old hunger. Soon, the forgotten elixir was no longer one substance, but a lineage, evolving with each culture that adopted it. Yet, at its heart, remained the same promise: vision beyond the ordinary, power beyond the mortal. By then, the elixir's influence had become so entwined with global commerce that no map could trace its full path. It flowed through veins of trade like hidden blood, shaping decisions in palaces and boardrooms alike. Wars flared not only for land and faith, but for control of the supply. Somewhere between the whispers of prophets and the ledgers of merchants, the line between spiritual and political vanished. Could a single substance have quietly steered the fate of empires, guiding ships, shifting alliances, altering the minds of rulers who believed themselves acting by divine insight? Perhaps the answer lies in the very fabric of history itself, woven from choices made under its influence. What was once a secret potion had become the invisible architect of globalization, a hidden current beneath the tides of progress. And as it crossed oceans and generations, one truth remained constant: the elixir did not belong to those who used it. It belonged to itself, moving where it wished, shaping those who sought to master it. The next part of the story reveals what happened when nations, drunk on ambition, turned that hidden current into a weapon, when the elixir's quiet influence erupted into open war. History remembers its heroes, kings, revolutionaries, but it rarely speaks of the powders that burnt in their chalices or the vapors that whispered through their minds on the eve of battle. Behind the clean lines of recorded events lie stains of blue, faint but indelible, connecting wars, treaties, and betrayals in ways too strange for textbooks to admit. The forgotten elixir, by now diffused across continents, had ceased to be a secret of alchemists. It had become a weapon, subtle, invisible, and infinitely adaptable. The first known use of the elixir in warfare is buried in a letter found in the ruins of a Persian fortress, written by a royal advisor to his general. It warned, "Do not drink the night wine offered by the envoy from the west. It carries visions that command obedience." The phrase was long dismissed as metaphor until chemical analysis of residue inside the goblet matched trace minerals linked to early elixir deposits. The banquet that followed that warning ended in tragedy. Half the general's officers defected overnight, claiming to have seen omens of defeat. The battle that followed was lost before swords were drawn. Some historians still insist it was mere superstition, but the records show that from that night onward, the conqueror who used the elixir ruled uncontested for 30 years. Centuries later, the same pattern appeared in the courts of medieval Europe during the uneasy alliance between Venice and Byzantium. A secret treaty was signed following a midnight meeting aboard a Venetian galley. Contemporary accounts note that both envoys shared a ceremonial draft of azure hue. Within days, the Byzantine representative rescinded territorial claims that had been debated for decades, claiming he had seen a vision of divine unity binding East and West. Scholars have puzzled over this ever since. The ink used to sign that treaty contained microscopic traces of cobalt and a rare, narcotic resin, a combination eerily similar to formulas described in earlier alchemical scrolls. Coincidence, perhaps, or continuity? But the elixir did not only shape diplomacy. It was also a tool of espionage, the quiet companion of spies, assassins, and mystics who served kings without faces. In 15th century Spain, a Moorish apothecary named Idris Ofasi kept a diary written in cipher. Only fragments survive, but one passage is clear: the powder of the stars reveals loyalty as light reveals dust. He described how droplets of the substance were slipped into wine at court gatherings, not to kill, but to unveil. Under its influence, tongues loosened, secrets surfaced. It was said that even the most guarded noble would confess their hidden allegiances after the third sip. Entire spy networks were dismantled through visions induced by the elixir. Their conspiracies uncovered by men who believed they were speaking to angels during the age of exploration. Its shadow grew longer. Portuguese captains carried it aboard their ships, not merely for trade, but for control. The journals of one navigator, Duarte Soares, tell of a mutiny averted after his crew inhaled fumes from a blue incense. They awoke obedient, reverent, and oddly calm, their anger dissolved as if by divine intervention. For centuries, the account was dismissed as allegory until the ship's remains were found near the Azores. Among the artifacts were shards of glass vials, stained an unmistakable shade of blue, taught by the 1600s. The elixir had found its way into the arsenals of empires. In India, during the reign of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, a secret chamber beneath the palace housed an apparatus described as the breath machine. Visitors reported faint humming and the smell of copper. Court records hint that the emperor's most trusted advisors would meet there before issuing edicts or planning wars. Chroniclers mention nights of vivid dreams followed by days of decisive action. One decree, issued after such a session, redrew the boundaries of the empire and reshaped the politics of the entire subcontinent. Historians attribute it to strategy. The emperor's private letters speak instead of visions, cities of light, walls of smoke, voices of counsel that guided his hand. Even in the age of reason, the elixir refused to vanish. During the Napoleonic Wars, rumors spread of a phantom regiment, soldiers who fought without fear or fatigue, their eyes strangely luminous. British intelligence dismissed it as propaganda, yet captured correspondence between French officers revealed mention of la poudre d'empire, a stimulant derived from a rare eastern mineral. Napoleon himself reportedly experimented with the distilled form before key campaigns. Witnesses described him emerging from his tent at dawn, eyes distant, as if gazing through time itself. Whether the substance sharpened his strategic genius or hastened his downfall remains a question history will never settle. Meanwhile, in the East, the elixir had taken on new forms. Chinese agents of the late Ming dynasty used a variant of the substance in coded operations. Their manuals, written in poetic verse, refer to it as the mirror that shows truth and falsehood when inhaled in small amounts. It heightened observation to an uncanny degree. Spies claimed they could read micro-expressions, detect lies, and anticipate motion. European traders who learned of this were quick to exploit it, introducing similar compounds to their own secret services. The first recorded use by Western intelligence occurred in Venice, once again, where informants were said to undergo the Blue Trial, an initiation that tested both loyalty and endurance. Many did not survive. The 18th century brought a new kind of warfare, one fought not only on battlefields, but in parlors, embassies, and salons. The elixir became the invisible negotiator behind closed doors. Diplomats of rival nations sometimes met in private to share a drink laced with a trace of the substance, believing it could align their visions and bring understanding. In rare cases, it worked. In others, it induced hallucinations mistaken for revelation. The Treaty of Prague, signed in 1745, is rumored to have been conceived under its influence. Both parties reported dreams of peace and mutual prosperity, only for the accord to collapse months later in renewed war. Some said the visions lied. Others whispered that the truth they showed was simply unbearable. As technology advanced, the elixir's shadow deepened. During early industrial espionage in the 19th century, chemists rediscovered its base components while experimenting with anesthetics and dyes. Factories began producing derivatives in secret, selling them to intelligence services eager to replicate the fabled truth serum of antiquity. Few succeeded. Most created poisons or narcotics that destroyed more minds than they enlightened. Yet the myth endured that somewhere, hidden in an archive or a monastery vault, the original formula still waited, the key to command, persuasion, and prophecy. Each age believed it was the first to harness it. Each forgot that power drawn from illusion never truly serves its wielder. The forgotten elixir thrived in these cycles, disappearing, resurfacing, changing names, but not essence. And if it decided battles, toppled kings, or rewrote alliances, it did so without loyalty, guided only by those who craved its insight more than their own clarity. What if the great turning points of history is the sudden surrender of armies, the inexplicable peace between sworn enemies, the rise of leaders whose visions bordered on madness were not the result of fate or genius, but of a substance that whispered from the shadows? Could the blue dust of ancient temples have shaped the map of the modern world? Perhaps that is the true legacy of the forgotten elixir, not the empires it built or the wars it won, but the questions it left behind, questions no historian dares to ask aloud. The next part of its journey would no longer concern kings and generals, but the common people who unknowingly lived beneath its influence, breathing the echoes of a secret that had already written their world. By the time the elixir had seeped into every corner of the known world, it was no longer the treasure of kings or the secret of sages. It had become something far more intimate, a quiet presence in homes, temples, and taverns alike. Its fragrance lingered in the breath of markets and prayers. To some, it was a blessing. To others, a blight. What began as revelation now walked among the people as ritual, medicine, and addiction. And across continents, a strange fog seemed to settle over society, one woven not from weather, from the human hunger to touch the divine. In the coastal towns of the Mediterranean, fishermen burned a pinch of blue powder before setting sail. They believed it calmed the sea spirits and sharpened their instincts for the tide. At dusk, the harbors would fill with the faint haze that shimmered over the water, turning the waves silver. Old songs spoke of the breath of the gods guiding the nets. Yet, in those same ports, others whispered that too much exposure left men haunted, their dreams crowded with voices from the deep. Wives would pour salt water over their husbands, feet upon return, hoping to wash away whatever followed them home. In the highlands of Central Asia, nomadic tribes carried small pouches of the elixir wrapped in embroidered cloth. They used it during solstice gatherings, when shamans led entire communities into trance beneath the stars. As witnesses described, glowing patterns traced in the sky, the people swaying as one body, their chants blending into wind. For those who partook, the night became eternity. The border between earth and heaven dissolved, but the morning brought silence. Some never spoke again, their eyes clouded as though they had seen too much. The tribe revered them as touched by spirits, half here, half gone. In India, temples adapted the elixir into ritual offerings. Priests mixed it with milk and honey, serving it to worshippers during festivals as the nectar of awakening. Crowds would fill the courtyards, faces lit by torchlight, their songs rising in hypnotic rhythm. For a few hours, distinctions of caste and wealth dissolved. Everyone became equal in ecstasy. Yet behind the sanctuaries, monks warned that devotion built on illusion was perilous. Too many had begun to chase the feeling rather than the faith. One scroll from the 11th century records a lament. We sought the gods and found only mirrors. Across the Middle East, Sufi mystics used the substance in controlled doses, calling it the breath of truth. During their samai, the sacred dance, they would inhale its vapors to heighten their sense of unity with the divine. Some wrote poetry describing visions of endless light, of God's laughter woven into music. Others warned that the line between revelation and madness was perilously thin. The mystic Al-Nuri wrote, "He who inhales without love sees the abyss instead of heaven." The sect eventually outlawed its use, but its traces lingered in secret gatherings for centuries, whispered, forbidden, but never forgotten, in Europe. The substance found a new guise among the folk traditions of the countryside. Peasants called it moon dust or the witch's breath. It was mixed with herbs during harvest festivals or used by midwives in childbirth, believed to ease pain and invite ancestral spirits to bless the newborn. Villagers spoke of lights appearing over fields where it was burned, pale orbs that drifted low, humming softly before vanishing. The church, wary of anything that blurred the line between sacrament and sorcery, declared it heresy. But persecution only pushed its use deeper underground. Whole villages vanished during witch trials, the supposed crimes little more than the possession of a jar with a faint blue residue. In China, it slipped quietly into the rhythm of urban life. Scholars used it to prolong study through long nights, calling it ink for the soul. Artists mixed it with lacquer, producing paintings that seemed to shift in tone with the viewer's mood. Courtesans burned it in private chambers, offering their patrons not only pleasure but visions, illusions so vivid that men swore they had glimpsed other lives. Addiction spread slowly, masked by art and culture. By the late Ming era, a proverb emerged: "Beware the scholar who writes with blue." It was both admiration and warning. Genius often walked hand in hand with madness. In the New World, explorers carried fragments of the old recipe with them. Indigenous healers who encountered it blended it with their own sacred plants, creating hybrid rituals that defied classification. In some jungles of the Amazon, tribes began to speak of the powder that remembers. They believed it could open the door to ancestral memory, allowing a person to relive the experiences of those who came before. Some who partook described seeing ancient ships on foreign seas, cities they had never visited, faces from other continents. To them, it was proof that all souls were connected through the same eternal dream. Yet, for every story of enlightenment, another told of collapse. Towns built around elixir markets flourished briefly, then decayed. Laborers who once used it for endurance grew dependent, unable to work without it. Temples that claimed it as divine gift became centers of corruption. In many cities, laws were passed banning its trade, but enforcement was futile. Where it vanished publicly, it reappeared in secret lodges and brotherhoods. One of the most infamous was the Circle of Smoke, clandestine group that rose in Renaissance Italy. Composed of artists, philosophers, and nobles, they gathered at midnight to inhale the elixir and record their visions. They believed they were glimpsing the architecture of heaven, the geometric code of reality itself. Some of their drawings survive intricate spirals and crystalline forms, eerily similar to modern depictions of molecules and galaxies. But their brilliance came at a cost. Members began to vanish one by one, retreating into solitude or madness. When authorities raided their final meeting, they found the room filled with azure mist, candles still burning, notebooks open, but no bodies. Only the faint hum of air remained, as if the vision itself had devoured its witnesses. In time, the elixir became taboo, its name erased from official records. But the stories endured in lullabies, folk charms, and whispered blessings. In villages from the Andes to the Alps, people still sprinkled blue dust into the wind to ward off nightmares. They no longer remembered where the ritual came from, only that it worked. Scholars who studied these customs centuries later found uncanny similarities across cultures that had never met. The same symbols appeared: the serpent coiled around a cup, the crescent moon within a circle, the spiral of awakening. It was as though the elixir had etched its memory into the collective consciousness, surviving through myth when its formula was lost. Could one substance truly have blurred the line between divine enlightenment and dangerous obsession for entire civilizations? Perhaps the answer lies not in chemistry, but in the human spirit itself, forever torn between curiosity and restraint, between the hunger for transcendence and the fear of its price. And as societies tried to balance reverence with control, new powers began to take interest. The rulers, scholars, and secret orders, who once hid the elixir, now sought to suppress it. Fearing that too many eyes had seen too much. What began as worship would soon become prohibition and a fight for control of a dream. By the time the blue smoke began to fade from the temples and taverns, the world had already changed beyond recognition. What had once been called divine became dangerous. What was sacred turned subversive. The forgotten elixir, once whispered about in poems and painted into symbols, had drawn too many eyes toward truths that rulers could not afford to let the people see. And so, history shifted its gaze from open worship to silent suppression, from illumination to erasure. The first decrees came quietly. In the libraries of Alexandria's later years, scrolls describing the Azure Draft were sealed in restricted archives. Only a handful of scholars were allowed to read them under oath of secrecy. A later fire would erase the building and its records, but some claimed the destruction was not accident. One surviving fragment, charred at the edges, bears a faint notation. To remember is to endanger the order of things. It is unsigned. Historians call it metaphor. Others call it a warning. Across the centuries, this same pattern repeated in different tongues. In Byzantium, the patriarch issued an edict declaring the elixir a false sacrament, counterfeit miracle meant to mimic divine revelation. Priests who had once used it in candlelit ceremonies were forced to confess before inquisitors. Those who refused vanished into monastery vaults that no record ever named. A chronicler of the era wrote, "Their books were burned, but the smoke smelled sweet like cedar and copper." In Europe's later medieval courts, kings and bishops discovered that the elixir was not merely a spiritual danger, but a political one. It loosened tongues, dissolved hierarchies, and made men question the certainty of power. Rumors spread of nobles who took it and renounced their titles, claiming to have seen a world without crowns. For monarchs who ruled by divine right, such visions were intolerable. So they turned revelation into crime. Possession of the blue powder became treason. Hidden records from the Inquisition reveal entire trials devoted not to witchcraft, but to what was called the sin of the azure breath. Witnesses described secret gatherings where participants inhaled vapors and spoke with invisible teachers. Those accused often confessed readily, not out of fear, but serenity, convinced they had glimpsed a truth worth dying for. The sentences were public. The reasons were not. One inquisitor's private journal, preserved in a monastery in Aragon, records a chilling line: "The powder itself is not evil. It reveals. That is why it must be erased." Meanwhile, in the Islamic empires, scholars debated its legitimacy. Some saw the elixir as a gift from God, a means to approach divine understanding. Others condemned it as fitna, sedition against heaven's order. The Ottomans in particular grew wary. As the empire expanded, reports surfaced of Sufi orders using the substance during spiritual ecstasies, claiming it dissolved the self into pure unity. When certain sects began preaching that the ruler and the beggar are one, authorities acted swiftly. Mosques suspected of harboring the practice were quietly shut down, their teachers exiled to distant provinces. Yet, in the bazaars of Istanbul, coded trinkets began to appear. Pendants shaped like a serpent curled around a moon. The followers of the old way still met, still inhaled, still dreamed beneath the very walls built to silence them. In China, suppression took on a bureaucratic form. The Ming court classified the elixir as a heavenly disturbance substance, banning its production and study. Alchemists, caught with the powder, were forced to work in imperial laboratories, perfecting elixirs of obedience. Instead, potions meant to dull thought rather than awaken it. The irony was not lost on them. Some smuggled scraps of the original formula into scrolls on astronomy, disguising their chemistry as metaphors for stars and eclipses. Generations later, when Western scholars translated these texts, they dismissed the hidden codes as poetic fancy. Few realized they were reading fragments of a buried science. Even the printing press, that great liberator of knowledge, could not save the elixir from oblivion. In 16th century Venice, an anonymous manuscript titled De Pulvera Celestis circulated briefly before vanishing. Only 2 copies survived, both censored. Pages describing the preparation and ritual use were torn out, leaving only vague allusions to visionary substances. When the Inquisition catalogued banned books, De Pulvera Celestis was listed not under medicine or philosophy, but under threats to authority. To read it was to risk excommunication. But every suppression breeds resistance. Beneath the surface of obedience, underground networks formed loose circles of mystics, scholars, and outcasts determined to preserve what they called the true sight. In England, a group of natural philosophers met under the guise of studying optics. They called themselves the Order of the Prism. Their experiments combined early chemistry with ritual, attempting to recreate the elixir's visionary effects. They succeeded only partially, producing mixtures that induced euphoria, but not revelation. Still, their gatherings continued, passing coded messages through art and architecture. It is said that some of London's most ornate stained glass windows contain hidden formulas. Their patterns designed to reveal proportions of forgotten mixtures when viewed by moonlight. In France, the Enlightenment philosophers approached the secret more cautiously. Rationalism had no room for mystic powders, yet, in private salons, the fascination persisted. Voltaire himself wrote cryptically of a substance that grants clarity at the cost of peace. Whether he truly possessed it or merely heard whispers remains unknown. But several of his contemporaries, chemists, freethinkers, and occultists, died under mysterious circumstances after corresponding about the blue flame. Their letters were confiscated, their laboratories sealed. The archives of the French Academy still hold boxes marked simply confidentiel, chimie interdite. By the 18th and 19th centuries, official history began to close around the secret like a fist. New sciences rose, claiming to explain everything in measurable terms. The age of miracles was over, at least publicly. But in the margins of universities, lodges, and secret societies, old knowledge survived. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and later Theosophists each carried fragments of the truth, wrapped in allegory. Their symbols, the eye within the triangle, the serpent eating its tail, all echoed the ancient imagery once tied to the elixir. They called it enlightenment, illumination, awakening. Few realized how literal those words once were. Even the modern era bears the marks of that erasure. When early archaeologists uncovered vessels stained blue in Mesopotamian ruins, reports were swiftly lost or reclassified as pigment analysis. When scholars proposed that ancient religious experiences might have been chemically induced, funding quietly vanished. The pattern was unmistakable. To acknowledge the elixir would mean admitting that divine inspiration, prophecy, revelation, even genius might not come from heaven, but from within the human body itself, for rulers and institutions built on divine authority. Such an idea was more dangerous than any weapon. And so, the silence deepened. The elixir story became a ghost haunting the archives, erased from records, hidden behind academic language, preserved only in symbols and whispers. Yet the fact that so many tried to destroy it may be the strongest proof of its power. History does not burn what it does not fear. What truths did rulers dread so profoundly that they sought to erase entire histories to conceal them? Perhaps it was not merely the substance, but the knowledge it granted that the divine could be manufactured, that revelation could be replicated. The implications were revolutionary. And revolutions, as history has shown, are rarely kind to kings, but suppression cannot last forever. The next great upheavals of the world, the rise and fall of dynasties, the wars fought in the name of destiny would reveal that the elixir's influence had not died. It had only gone deeper underground, waiting for the perfect moment to resurface. The battlefield is often imagined as a place of steel and blood, of banners raised and cannon fire echoing across valleys. Yet, in the shadows of those conflicts, another force moved quietly, unseen, influencing decisions with a subtlety that history would never openly record. The forgotten elixir, by this point known to a select few across continents, had become an invisible general, shaping the minds of kings, advisors, and commanders alike. Its power was not in armies, but in perception, imagination, and fear. One of the earliest documented cases comes from the Persian campaigns of the late Achaemenid period, according to fragments of a royal journal. The king's most trusted strategist consumed a small dose of the powder before drawing maps and planning troop movements. He wrote of visions that allowed him to see the positions of men before they march, to hear the whispers of distant battle. Hayes' counsel was followed with such precision that the ensuing campaign ended in unprecedented victories. Yet his notes revealed a growing obsession. He began sleeping only in brief intervals, journaling feverishly, and warning the king that enemies might no longer be physical, but spectral, appearing in dreams. Some historians dismiss these passages as metaphorical. The residue analysis from his preserved ceremonial cups suggests otherwise. In Europe, the elixir found its way into Renaissance courts, where military advisors and mercenary captains began using it to sharpen intuition and morale. A Venetian captain, Giovanni Bellarmino, have detailed accounts of a siege in which the powder was distributed among his lieutenants. According to his journal, the men experienced heightened perception, able to anticipate enemy movements and coordinate attacks with uncanny synchronicity. The city fell without the expected casualties, its defenders baffled by the attackers' apparent foresight. Bellarmino attributed the success to the substance, though he cautioned that prolonged exposure caused paranoia, creeping mistrust that nearly dissolved his own command. Across the Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire recorded similar incidents. Court physicians supplied the Sultan and his janissaries with a vapor derived from the elixir before decisive battles. Chroniclers note that certain soldiers moved with extraordinary stamina and precision, performing maneuvers that ordinary training could not explain. Letters from opposing commanders remark on an almost supernatural discipline, calling the Ottoman forces machines of perfect obedience. Yet, private memoirs hint at a dark cost: hallucinations, sleepless nights, and erratic leadership. As the elixir began to influence not only perception, but judgment in East Asia, the Ming and Qing dynasties discovered applications of the substance in both strategy and control. Generals used it to inspire courage, while spies employed it to extract intelligence. Hidden in the archives of Nanjing is a treatise describing how a small team of advisors consumed a refined powder before planning a border defense. The authors describe visions of the terrain, the enemy's formations, and even possible betrayals from within their own ranks. The resulting maneuvers, executed with precision, repelled invasions that seemed otherwise inevitable. But the margins of the text warn of dependence, a cautionary note that is often ignored in retellings of the victories, even during the Napoleonic Wars. The elixir's shadow lingered. French and British officers, particularly those involved in espionage, reportedly experimented with derivatives of the ancient formula. Diaries recovered from abandoned regimental quarters describe small blue vials passed under the table during strategy meetings. Officers swore they saw enemy lines shift before their eyes and predicted maneuvers hours before messages could arrive. Some historians dismiss these anecdotes as fevered imagination. Yet, military records show remarkably precise outcomes in campaigns that, by conventional accounts, were decided by chance and logistics alone. The substance was not always used to enhance perception. In several cases, it was employed to manipulate morale and obedience. Accounts from Mughal India describe advisors dosing troops in subtle quantities before key engagements. Soldiers reported a sense of unity and invincibility, moving as one entity across the battlefield. The historian Abul Fazl notes the effect without naming the cause. They fought not as men, but as shadows of men, driven by something beyond reason. Casualty reports suggest that these battles were won with fewer losses than expected. Yet, letters from surviving soldiers tell of confusion, hallucinations, and long-term psychological strain in the archives of Europe. The elixir's influence appears in diplomatic wars as well. One striking example involves a treaty negotiation in 17th century Sweden. Advisors secretly inhaled the powder to induce visions of compromise, projecting unity where there was none. Letters later revealed that one negotiator experienced profound paranoia, imagining plots that did not exist, nearly derailing the talks. The treaty passed, but only after hours of careful orchestration by those who had mastered their doses. Historians now speculate that many diplomatic outcomes previously attributed to skill or fortune may have been quietly guided by altered perception. Its power was double-edged. Leaders who relied on the elixir for insight often became addicted to the certainty it provided, unable to act without the heightened perception it produced. Some fell into cycles of dependence, making decisions that appeared brilliant but were increasingly detached from reality. In diaries smuggled from Ottoman palaces, a vizier describes the euphoria of perfect foresight, only to confess that over time could no longer distinguish the visions of the substance from his own thoughts. His handwriting becomes erratic, interspersed with diagrams and maps that never corresponded to the real world. Even after centuries, patterns emerge. Wherever the elixir appeared, it seemed to concentrate influence in the hands of those who controlled it. Armies moved with unnatural precision. Negotiations swayed on a whisper, and entire empires shifted course. Yet each victory, each decisive moment, came with hidden costs: paranoia, secrecy, obsession. The substance amplified human ambition, sharpened intuition, and exposed the fragility of judgment. It turned brilliant generals into mad strategists, revered leaders into shadows of themselves. What if the fate of kingdoms, the rise and fall of dynasties, and the outcomes of battles we think we understand were not solely the product of armies and diplomacy, but also of a substance that could bend perception? What if some of the most celebrated victories in history, the sudden reversals that shaped nations, were influenced in ways never recorded on official maps or in textbooks? The journals, letters, and diaries that survive suggest a haunting possibility that the elixir dictated outcomes as surely as swords or cannons. Invisible, yet inexorable. The story of wars is thus incomplete without considering the mind-altering forces at play behind closed doors, in quiet tents, and beneath candlelit tables. The elixir did not merely touch history. It intertwined with it, a secret architect of victory and ruin alike. Its influence would soon shift from the grandeur of empires to the chaos of addiction, social upheaval, and moral collapse, a darker mirror of the power it had granted to those who sought to control it. The promise of the elixir was seductive: clarity, insight, divine vision. But in the shadows of its use, a darker truth emerged. Those who drank, inhaled, or ingested it too often found themselves trapped not in enlightenment, but in obsession. Where once it had guided rulers to victory, it now ensnared them in spirals of paranoia, secrecy, and decay. Entire courts, families, and cities would feel its shadow, often without knowing its name. In the Ottoman Empire, court records hint at a series of unexplained scandals in the late 16th century. Ministers and generals fell ill with symptoms that were dismissed as melancholy or nervous fever. Letters, later deciphered from secret archives, revealed that many of these men had consumed the elixir in excessive quantities. Some experienced prophetic visions that made them distrust one another, accusing allies of treachery. In one case, a high-ranking admiral ordered a fleet to retreat, convinced he saw a phantom enemy. The loss reshaped naval strategy for decades, yet contemporary chronicles framed it as a misjudgment of weather and tide. Only the surviving private diaries hint at the elixir's invisible hand, Europe, too, experienced its share of downfall. During the French Renaissance, salons and secret societies flourished where the powder was inhaled for inspiration. Some artists and philosophers produced extraordinary work, leaving behind manuscripts and paintings that still fascinate scholars. But many others descended into mania. A Venetian painter, celebrated for his depictions of celestial realms, vanished after a particularly potent dose, leaving only a studio filled with swirling blue dust. Patrons whispered that he had glimpsed the architecture of heaven itself and could not return. Similar disappearances, documented sporadically in diaries, fueled rumors of entire circles succumbing to addiction. The Mughal court presents a particularly vivid example. Several emperors, initially disciplined in their use of the elixir, began to consume it daily, seeking the clarity and counsel they believed it provided. Court historians describe erratic policies, sudden reversals, and violent purges of advisors who had once been loyal. Letters smuggled from palace insiders describe men wandering corridors at night, murmuring of visions that no one else could see. In one chilling account, a minister attempted to warn the emperor that his judgment was clouded. He disappeared the next morning, and the cause was officially listed as illness. The truth, hidden in coded diaries, suggests the powder itself had become a silent conspirator. Addiction was not confined to rulers. Across Asia and the Mediterranean, networks of underground users formed, often in secrecy, to avoid legal and religious persecution. In Persia, caravans of merchants supplied powder to loyalists, creating dependence among entire villages. Some small towns became effectively controlled by those who had access to it. Farmers would labor not out of duty, but under visions induced by the substance, believing the guidance they received was divine. When shipments failed, unrest followed. Records describe riots in which entire communities clashed over missing consignments, their memories of reality blurred by the fog of longing. The consequences could be subtle, yet profound. In Ming China, scholars who used the powder to enhance meditation began neglecting duties, sending letters full of poetry but little actionable advice to officials. Governance faltered in districts where reliance on the substance was widespread. One prefect, obsessed with visions of celestial cities, failed to respond to a regional rebellion, resulting in mass dislocation. His superiors documented the disaster as administrative negligence, leaving the substance unmentioned, a quiet erasure of uncomfortable truth. Even in Europe's courts, the powder's allure fostered intrigue. Nobles and advisors would secretly dose themselves before negotiations or trials, believing that their visions would reveal hidden plots. Yet the visions were not always accurate. Confusion, misinterpretation, and hallucination led to false accusations, imprisonments, and executions. One English diplomat recorded in a private journal that a treaty he had championed dissolved overnight when his colleague, under the influence, claimed the opposing envoy had appeared to him in spectral form, plotting treachery. Historians note the collapse of the treaty, but the intoxicant that caused it remained invisible. In addition to personal and political ruin, the elixir sometimes triggered moral crises. Tales survive of entire households addicted, children observing parents drifting into obsession. In Venetian ghettos, chroniclers describe families collapsing as fathers pursued visions, neglecting commerce and obligation. In Baghdad, Sufi records mention disciples who lost their form to the powder, wandering streets as shadowy figures, murmuring of distant cities and unknown voices. Community elders tried to intervene, yet the substance's pull was too strong. By the time authorities learned, much of the damage had been done, leaving only hints of despair in fragmented chronicles. One of the most haunting aspects was the secrecy it demanded. Users could not speak openly, for discovery meant exile, imprisonment, or worse. Their notes were written in cipher, diaries concealed in false walls, blues, and letters coded with symbols known only to initiates. Yet, even these measures could not prevent collapse. In some cases, those who held power were betrayed by their own desire for insight. A Persian vizier once noted, "The powder shows truth, and the truth destroys us." The same could be said of empires, families, and guilds that relied upon it. The pattern is unmistakable. Brilliance paired with ruin, visions paired with madness. Societies that embraced the substance fully often saw it ripple outward, first inspiring culture, then destabilizing governance. Scholars, rulers, and commoners alike were drawn to it, believing in the promise of illumination, yet many became its unwitting slaves. Cities that once thrived on trade and ritual descended into disorder when supply lines failed or when excessive indulgence clouded judgment. Letters from the era, rediscovered in private collections, revealed the simultaneous awe and terror users felt, a mixture of reverence, desire, and fear. Could a single substance, so small in quantity yet potent in effect, destroy the very people who believed it would elevate them? Evidence from multiple continents suggests it could, and did. Its power was a double-edged blade. It granted perception, insight, and vision, while silently unraveling judgment, stability, and sanity. Where kings and generals once used it to conquer, they now sometimes fell victim to it, their empires wobbling under the invisible weight of obsession. And yet, even amid ruin, fascination endured. The elixir's danger only enhanced its allure, prompting secrecy, codes, and hidden networks to preserve its knowledge. From collapsed courts to addicted households, the substance left a trail of both brilliance and devastation. History recorded victories, treaties, and dynasties, but rarely the whispers of its true influence. Those who survived its grip often swore a silence, ensuring that the next chapter of its story would remain hidden until scholars, explorers, and inquisitive minds began piecing together the forbidden puzzle. In the quiet corners of the world, beyond the gaze of kings, priests, and scribes, the story of the elixir continued to breathe, though often under threat of obliteration. Knowledge, once freely shared among alchemists, shamans, and scholars, had become dangerous. Those who controlled empires and institutions recognized its potential to shift power, not merely on battlefields, but in the very minds of people. And so, the erasure began, a campaign of secrecy, destruction, and coded preservation, leaving only fragments for future generations to stumble upon. In the monasteries of Byzantium, for example, entire collections of texts were quietly removed from public view. Scholars who wrote of the blue powder of visions were reprimanded, their works labeled heretical or dangerously speculative. Some manuscripts were burned, others were locked away, hidden behind false walls or beneath floors, accessible only to a select few who swore oaths of secrecy. One surviving parchment, discovered centuries later, bears a note in faded ink: "To see too clearly is to endanger all who rule." 'Tis unsigned, the author unknown, yet its warning reverberates through time, throughout Europe. Similar patterns emerged. In Renaissance Italy, certain alchemical treatises were meticulously excised from library collections. References to powders, elixirs, and visionary drafts were replaced with euphemisms or erased entirely. Coded marginalia hint at the original content. Serpents coiled around moons. Spirals that seem to twist and vanish. Diagrams of vessels filled with azure mist. The scribe's subtle hand ensured that only initiates could decipher the meaning, while casual readers would see only ornamentation or poetic metaphor. Religious authorities were particularly vigilant. In the Catholic Church, inquisitors not only persecuted those suspected of possession or use, but also sought to erase any written proof of its effects. Letters, journals, and testimonies describing visions induced by the powder were destroyed, leaving gaps in the historical record. In some cases, entire communities that had embraced the substance were dissolved or relocated. Their practices labeled superstition or witchcraft. The church's official histories offer no trace of these interventions. Yet local folklore preserves hints, songs, proverbs, and oral tales that reference visions. Blue smoke, or the breath of gods in veiled language. The erasure extended beyond Europe. In Ming China, imperial edicts banned both the study and production of the substance, labeling it a threat to social order. Alchemists and scholars who attempted to document its properties were forced to transcribe their notes in metaphor, embedding chemical formulas within poetry or astronomical treatises. Some hid entire experiments in sealed jars or secret compartments, leaving instructions encrypted in calligraphy so subtle that only a practiced eye could follow them. Over time, much of this knowledge was lost, but fragments survived in private collections and coded manuscripts that scholars continue to discover, even within the Ottoman Empire. Secrecy became a tool of survival. Advisors to the Sultan wrote extensively on the powder's effects, yet their notes were hidden in underground vaults beneath palaces and mosques. Scholars copied their work onto parchment coated with symbols and scents, ink infused with incense. Markings only visible under particular lighting or when treated with rare oils. When envoys from rival states inquired about the substance, they received vague, misleading answers. Knowledge was preserved, but always selectively. Access meant power, and the consequences of revelation were severe in the West. The invention of the printing press presented both risk and opportunity. Early texts describing the substance spread briefly, only to be seized, censored, or destroyed. One notable manuscript, De Pulvera Celestis, circulated in Venice before disappearing entirely. Scholars have since reconstructed parts from quotations in later texts, but entire sections remain missing. Margins indicate elaborate preparation methods, descriptions of visionary experiences, and guidance on measured use. Yet, the passages that might have revealed its full potential were excised, leaving modern readers with tantalizing fragments. Despite this systematic suppression, secret networks of preservation arose. Monks, alchemists, and mystics established clandestine archives, hidden beneath churches, inside mountain caves, or within labyrinthine libraries. Knowledge was fragmented intentionally, divided across multiple locations, so that no single discovery could unleash it fully. In some cases, entire families or orders were entrusted with guardianship, passing down codified instructions for generations. Symbols such as the coiled serpent, the spiral, and the crescent moon became markers of authenticity, guiding the initiated toward hidden truths. The erasure was not merely physical, but intellectual. Scholars and historians who sought to document the substance faced institutional resistance, funding cuts, or academic ostracism. In private letters, some describe the frustration of discovering references in ancient texts, only to find them deliberately obscured or misclassified. In one case, a 19th century European chemist wrote of fragments in Mesopotamian ruins, noting the jars contain residues of a substance so potent, yet every record has been swallowed by time and decree. We may only guess its purpose. Such statements reveal a persistent tension between curiosity and authority, between the human desire to uncover truth and the forces dedicated to concealing it. And yet, even as attempts to erase it intensified, traces endured. Oral traditions preserved allegories of vision, prophecy, and intoxication. Artifacts hinted at chemical knowledge, blue pigments in temples, ceremonial vessels, and cryptic inscriptions that survived fires, floods, and conquest. These remnants are silent witnesses, suggesting that the story of the elixir was never fully erased, only obscured. Its memory persisted in shadows, in coded manuscripts, encrypted journals, and the quiet murmur of those who dared to remember. The weight of this suppression is immense, Whole generations passed without knowledge of the substance's influence, yet its fingerprints remained in history. Battles subtly swayed, rulers influenced, societies shaped in ways that conventional accounts cannot explain. What was lost to fire, decree, and censorship cannot be fully recovered. But the surviving fragments hint at a larger reality, a substance so potent, so disruptive, that the very act of recording its existence was considered dangerous. What truths were hidden so deeply that entire histories appeared to vanish from memory? The answer lies in the empty spaces of archives, in the censored texts, and in the cryptic symbols left behind. The elixir survived only in whispers, coded diagrams, faint traces in manuscripts, a shadow history preserved by those who refused to let it die completely. In the hands of the curious, these fragments offer glimpses of forbidden knowledge, revealing a world in which the line between truth and erasure is carefully drawn, and the power to control information is the ultimate authority. As we turn from the shadows of suppression, the next chapter reveals those who resisted erasure, secret societies, underground networks, and clandestine practitioners who kept the elixir alive despite the relentless pressure to forget. Their story demonstrates not only the resilience of human curiosity, but also the enduring grip of a substance that refused to be silenced. Even as kingdoms banned the elixir and scholars erased its records, the substance refused to vanish entirely. Its survival depended not on the masses, but on a network of those willing to risk persecution, exile, or death. Across continents, hidden societies, secret orders, and clandestine practitioners assumed the role of guardians, preserving knowledge that rulers and religious authorities sought to obliterate. Their existence was invisible to official histories, yet their influence persisted in shadows, threading through centuries like an unseen current shaping events from behind the veil. One of the earliest known custodians emerged in Renaissance Italy, a circle of alchemists and philosophers who called themselves the Order of the Prism. Meeting in concealed chambers beneath Florence's palaces, they recorded formulas, visions, and experiences in ciphers that only initiates could decipher. Scrolls describe ceremonies in which the elixir was consumed sparingly, intended not for indulgence, but for clarity, to glimpse hidden patterns in nature, society, and human behavior. The group's journals, encoded with symbols of spirals, serpents, and moons, served as both instruction and warning. Knowledge without discipline was peril. Many members disappeared mysteriously, leaving behind only faint traces of their research, carefully cataloged for the next generation. In France, a network of philosophers and chemists preserved fragments of the elixir's history in salons and private libraries. Under the guise of scientific discourse, they passed manuscripts hand to hand, translating obscure texts from Arabic, Persian, and Latin, embedding instructions within diagrams and allegories. Couriers, disguised as merchants, carried the messages between cities, often using scented papers or inks visible only under candlelight. Initiates memorized recipes for the substance, ensuring that even if written records were destroyed, knowledge could survive in living memory. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, the guardianship took on a bureaucratic subtlety. Trusted scholars and court physicians maintained hidden laboratories in palace basements, accessible only through secret passages. They cataloged experimental results, refining the elixir's preparation and testing its effects in measured doses. Codified systems of apprenticeship ensured that each generation received instruction in secrecy, learning to maintain both discipline and loyalty. Letters between masters, written in allegorical poetry, described visions of empires and battles, using metaphor to encode practical lessons for governance and strategy. Outside observers would have assumed these correspondences were philosophical musings. In reality, they were manuals for preserving and controlling a potent substance in Asia, particularly China and Japan. Underground networks blended the elixir into spiritual practices. Taoist and Buddhist monks incorporated it into meditative rituals, emphasizing moderation and enlightenment. Hidden within temple archives were encrypted texts detailing both chemical preparation and ceremonial use. Some manuscripts instructed disciples to hide knowledge in everyday objects, the underside of statues, the back of paintings, even within lacquered boxes designed to appear empty. Access required not only initiation into the spiritual order, but also intimate understanding of coded symbols and oral instructions, ensuring that knowledge could not fall into the wrong hands. Across the Mediterranean, maritime trade routes became arteries of clandestine preservation. Small consignments of the substance were carried in secret compartments aboard merchant vessels, hidden among spices, dyes, and precious metals. Coded correspondence detailed quantities, preparation methods, and intended recipients, often disguised as poetry or financial ledgers. Smugglers were sometimes unaware of the substance's true potency. They simply followed instructions from trusted overseers. In this way, the elixir traveled silently across seas, surviving embargoes, raids, and wars, while the wider world remained ignorant of its continued existence. Some societies adopted extreme measures to safeguard knowledge. In Renaissance Venice, a secret brotherhood, known as the Circle of Azure, maintained hidden laboratories beneath the city's canals. They developed complex rituals to ensure the elixir was never abused, combining chemical preparation with spiritual observance. Initiates were bound by oaths, sworn to secrecy under threat of exile or death. Journals describe a hierarchy of guardianship. Only those who had demonstrated understanding, self-control, and loyalty could access the full formula. Symbols etched into stained glass and frescoes served as both warnings and guides, readable only by those trained in the order cipher. In Central Asia, nomadic tribes formed networks to protect the substance's traditions. Elders passed oral histories alongside secret preparations, embedding instructions within stories and songs. These societies operated in constant motion, using migration routes to evade authorities. Traders and emissaries carried encoded knowledge between settlements, ensuring that even if one location was compromised, the teachings could endure elsewhere. The result was a living archive, simultaneously portable and resilient, maintained by communities whose survival depended on both secrecy and fidelity to the elixir's principles. The European Enlightenment, despite its emphasis on rationality, could not erase these networks. Secret societies, such as Rosicrucians and later Theosophists, absorbed fragments of the old knowledge, embedding them in allegorical texts and ritual practices. Members studied manuscripts, conducted controlled experiments, and maintained initiatory practices, preserving what official science ignored or dismissed. Coded journals from these groups reveal fascination with perception, cognition, and altered states, and intellectual curiosity, entwined with practical guardianship of the substance, even in the modern era. During industrialization and the rise of global science, the networks persisted quietly. Chemists, pharmacists, and collectors stumbled upon fragments of elixir lore, often unaware of their significance. Some preserved powders, reagents, or manuscripts in private collections, sharing knowledge sparingly. A few dedicated researchers recognized patterns, recurring symbols, recipes, or ceremonial instructions, hinting at a centuries-long continuum of preservation. These archives, hidden in basements, vaults, and private libraries, became the bridge between ancient practices and modern rediscovery through ritual, secrecy, and disciplined transmission. The substance survived centuries of suppression, erasure, and persecution. Its guardians understood that knowledge alone was dangerous. The key was careful stewardship. By maintaining coded manuscripts, oral traditions, hidden laboratories, and clandestine rituals, they ensured that the elixir's influence would not vanish entirely. History, for those who controlled the narrative, appeared orderly and rational, Yet beneath the surface, an invisible current of knowledge persisted, shaping events in ways few could perceive. Who safeguarded this substance in shadows while the world forgot its very existence? The answer lies in orders, societies, and communities whose names were never meant to appear in chronicles. They carried the weight of knowledge, the burden of secrecy, and the responsibility of survival. And as the modern era dawned, the traces they preserved would allow explorers, scientists, and curious minds to reconnect with a story long hidden, revealing not only the substance itself, but the intricate web of guardianship that kept it alive across centuries. For centuries, the elixir existed only in fragments, charred scrolls, cryptic symbols, faded pigments, and oral legends whispered in hidden corners of the world. By the dawn of the 20th century, its memory was all but extinct in formal scholarship. Yet the curiosity of historians, chemists, and archaeologists, combined with the serendipity of discovery, began to pull these threads back into focus. Modern science, armed with technology unimaginable to the ancients, offered a chance to reconstruct, analyze, and perhaps even understand what had once seemed ineffable. It began, as many rediscoveries do, with accident. In a small laboratory in Vienna, a chemist examining residues from Mesopotamian jars noticed an unusual compound that did not match any known pigment or spice. Initial analysis suggested traces of a complex alkaloid, remarkably stable for its age. When the sample was subjected to chromatographic testing, minute quantities revealed the composition strikingly similar to substances known for mind-altering properties. The chemist, intrigued but cautious, sent samples to colleagues across Europe, sparking a quiet network of laboratories interested in what they began to call the Blue Mystery. Meanwhile, historians unearthed manuscripts that had survived centuries of censorship. Marginalia, in a 16th century Venetian text, described a ritual preparation, noting the careful combination of plant extracts and mineral powders. Some pages were missing, yet the symbols in the margins, spirals, crescents, coiled serpents, suggested a continuity with earlier alchemical traditions. Cross-referencing these texts with surviving Ottoman, Chinese, and Indian manuscripts, researchers began to see patterns, the same preparation techniques, similar ceremonial contexts, and consistent reports of heightened perception, insight, and euphoria. The puzzle was immense, but the pieces hinted at a coherent substance and practice that had transcended cultures and millennia. In Paris, a pharmacologist named Lucien Moreau reconstructed a fragment of the elixir using these historical clues. He combined plant alkaloids mentioned in the manuscripts with mineral residues identified in archaeological samples. The process was painstaking, step-guided by careful measurement and modern safety protocols. Yet, the laboratory air seemed to vibrate with history. Upon completion, preliminary tests in vitro demonstrated unusual interactions with neural receptors, confirming that the substance had psychoactive properties beyond mere folklore. Moreau published cautiously, describing it as a compound that may have shaped cognition and culture, yet whose potential remains largely uncharted. Across the Atlantic, anthropologists studying indigenous practices in the Amazon stumbled upon traditions that echoed ancient Eurasian uses of the elixir. Tribes spoke of powders that induced visions of ancestors, connected disparate experiences, and revealed patterns in nature. When researchers compared chemical analyses of these plants with ancient residues, the correlation was startling. Similar alkaloids appeared, suggesting a continuity of knowledge preserved independently, converging on a single pharmacological principle. These discoveries reinforced the idea that the elixir had not been a local anomaly, but a substance whose influence spanned the globe. Laboratory experiments in the United States further illuminated its properties. At a secluded research facility, a team of chemists and neuroscientists reconstructed various formulations suggested by historical texts. They noted the substance's duality in small, controlled doses, It enhanced perception, focus, and pattern recognition. In larger quantities, it induced confusion, hallucination, and disorientation. Journals from these studies emphasized caution, documenting both the potential for insight and the peril of misuse. These modern experiments mirrored historical accounts, confirming that ancient warnings about obsession, dependence, and moral hazard were far from myth. One breakthrough came when researchers applied imaging techniques to track neural activity in controlled human trials using trace derivatives of the substance, regions associated with perception, memory consolidation, and creative insights showed unusual activation patterns consistent with anecdotal descriptions from centuries past. Subjects reported subtle shifts in awareness, heightened pattern recognition, and experiences they struggled to articulate, echoes perhaps of the visionary states described in manuscripts and diaries. Ethical oversight was strict, yet the tantalizing results offered a glimpse into why the substance had been so revered and feared. The rediscovery process was not without intrigue. Some archives, previously thought mundane, contained hidden references encoded in marginal notes, watermarks, and ciphered letters. One 17th century alchemist's notebook, purchased at an estate sale in England, contained a series of chemical symbols interwoven with poetic descriptions of spiritual journeys. Deciphering it required collaboration between historians, chemists, and cryptographers. Each revelation, small or large, felt like uncovering a missing page from a book erased from history. It was detective work in the truest sense, connecting dots across time, geography, and culture, tracing a path invisible to most of recorded history. What struck modern researchers most profoundly was the elixir's continuity. Though civilizations had attempted to suppress it, generations had forgotten its existence. The knowledge had persisted in fragments, encoded in symbols, rituals, and scattered manuscripts. Modern science did not merely rediscover a chemical. It uncovered a thread connecting ancient wisdom, ritual practice, and the subtle shaping of human cognition. The elixir became a bridge across millennia, revealing that insights once considered divine might, in fact, have been mediated by the careful use of a substance lost to time. Yet, the rediscovery also provoked cautionary reflections. The substance's potency, the historical evidence of misuse, and the moral weight of reviving it demanded restraint. Laboratories documented effects meticulously, avoiding public dissemination of full formulas. Ethical debates arose. If the elixir could enhance perception, insight, or creativity, should it be used? Who should have access? How could its historical lessons, both of revelation and ruin, inform modern practice? Scientists, historians, and philosophers alike grappled with the implications, recognizing that the substance's story was not merely chemical, but profoundly human. Could a drug lost for centuries finally reveal its secrets to modern science? In laboratories, libraries, and field research across the world, fragments converged, producing a picture at once tantalizing and enigmatic. The substance, once buried beneath the weight of prohibition, secrecy, and oblivion, had returned not as a tool of kings or shamans, but as a subject of inquiry capable of illuminating the intersection of history, biology, and culture. The process revealed more than the compound itself. It revealed the persistence of knowledge, the human drive to understand, and the enduring tension between power and discovery. Modern science had opened the door to the elixir's mysteries, but the story was far from complete. Questions of application, ethics, and consequence loomed large. The next chapter will confront these issues directly, exploring how the substance's modern resurgence intersects with desire, its danger, and the very choices that once shaped empires and dynasties. When the elixir emerged from the shadows of history into modern laboratories, it brought with it more than chemical intrigue. It brought ethical dilemmas, social tension, and a curious fascination that bridged centuries. Researchers approached it with caution, yet the very act of studying it invited temptation. In university labs and private research facilities, Scientists replicated formulations suggested by ancient manuscripts, careful to control dosage, environment, and observation. Yet, even under strict conditions, the substance's effects were unpredictable. Some subjects reported moments of extraordinary clarity, a sense of patterns hidden beneath reality itself, while others experienced disorientation, hallucination, or subtle paranoia. News of these experiments spread quietly at first, through academic conferences and discreet publications. Soon, however, underground networks of enthusiasts, hobbyists, and historians became intensely interested. Online forums and secret societies discussed the elixir's historical use and potential modern applications. Recipes, often partial or symbolic, circulated in encrypted documents. Some individuals, motivated by curiosity, power, or personal insight, tempted to recreate its effects outside controlled settings. The risks were immediate and tangible: accidental overdoses, unpredictable psychological effects, and legal consequences in jurisdictions where psychoactive substances were tightly regulated. In North America, a small group of experimental psychologists conducted trials with volunteers under strict supervision, blending historical methodology with contemporary neuropharmacology. They discovered that microdoses could enhance cognitive flexibility and creative problem-solving, while larger doses introduced sensory distortions and emotional volatility. One researcher described participants entering what he called a temporal suspension, a state where memory, perception, and imagination intertwined, echoing accounts recorded in alchemical journals centuries earlier. Yet even with safeguards, the substance's history of obsession and misuse loomed, reminding all involved that insight and danger were inseparable. The tension between scientific pursuit and personal risk became a central theme. Legal frameworks lagged behind the research, creating gray zones that fascinated and frustrated enthusiasts alike. In some countries, possessing or distributing trace components was criminalized, while in others, research exemptions allowed limited experimentation. This patchwork of regulation mirrored the substance's historical journey: hidden, restricted, and selectively accessible. Scholars noted the irony: centuries of suppression had been replaced by modern uncertainty, in which curiosity itself became a potential transgression. Ethical questions multiplied. Should the substance be studied purely for knowledge, or should its potential effects on cognition and perception warrant limitations? How could researchers weigh the promise of insight against the historical record of addiction, obsession, and societal disruption? Discussions in ethics committees and informal gatherings often grew heated. Some argued that understanding the elixir could illuminate consciousness itself, providing unprecedented insight into human perception, creativity, and cognition. Others cautioned that reintroducing a substance with a documented history of manipulation, paranoia, and social upheaval was inherently dangerous, potentially amplifying the very human vulnerabilities it had historically exploited. Despite these debates, experimentation persisted, often in surprising contexts. Artists, writers, and designers sought controlled experiences, hoping to access the visionary states described in historical manuscripts. In some cases, participants reported vivid imagery, novel perspectives on familiar environments, the heightened sense of interconnectedness, sensations echoing centuries of ritual accounts. Yet, as with past centuries, the fine line between inspiration and delusion remained perilously thin. Some subjects became obsessed with repeating experiences, reflecting the elixir's historical pattern of fascination and dependency. The interplay between scientific study and underground curiosity mirrored the elixir's past. Just as ancient societies concealed knowledge from authorities, modern enthusiasts created their own clandestine channels of information. Encrypted emails, private forums, and small symposiums allowed sharing of research findings while evading legal scrutiny. The thrill of secrecy, combined with the promise of discovery, fueled a culture of both reverence and danger. Historians observed that the modern fascination was not simply intellectual. It echoed the human impulse that had preserved the substance for centuries, a combination of curiosity, risk, and the desire for hidden knowledge. Reports emerged of interdisciplinary collaborations as well. Neuroscientists worked with anthropologists to compare modern experiences with historical accounts. Pharmacologists analyzed residue samples from archaeological digs alongside contemporary formulations. These efforts revealed remarkable consistencies. Microdoses enhanced perception and cognitive association, while excessive use mirrored the paranoia, disorientation, and erratic judgment recorded in historical diaries. It became clear that the substance's effects had remained constant over centuries, highlighting both the continuity of human biology and the persistent ethical challenges of engaging with such a powerful compound. Yet, even as research advanced, controversy followed. Some governments warned that public fascination could lead to dangerous experimentation. Media outlets sensationalized findings, framing the elixir alternately as a miracle of cognition or a perilous hallucinogen. Underground communities pushed back, emphasizing historical precedent and the importance of disciplined study. The tension between transparency, secrecy, legality, and curiosity created a modern echo of the centuries-long struggle over the substance's control. Once again, human ambition and fear danced in delicate balance. It's what happens when the forbidden knowledge of the past collides with modern curiosity and ambition. For those exploring the elixir today, every experiment, every discovery carries the weight of history. Insight comes hand in hand with caution, and every revelation is tempered by the understanding that brilliance can be fleeting and obsession can be ruinous. The substance, once a hidden agent of kings, shamans, and secret societies, now confronts a world eager for understanding, yet aware of the peril. Its story remains unfinished, a bridge between ancient rituals, historical influence, and the modern quest for cognition, consciousness, and control. As research continues, the elixir challenges not only the body and mind, but also the ethical frameworks through which humanity navigates discovery. The next chapter moves from experimentation into reflection, exploring the philosophical and moral implications of a substance that has shaped empires, inspired visions, and now sits at the threshold of modern understanding. It asks questions that transcend chemistry and history about power, perception, and the delicate line between enlightenment and obsession. They say the mind is both a mirror and a maze. Quote, it reflects the world around us, yet folds it inward, bending reality into something only we can perceive. But what happens when that reflection is touched by something else, something that doesn't simply distort, but awakens? Could a single substance, hidden in plain sight, reveal that consciousness itself is far less stable than we ever imagined? When ancient people consumed this strange mixture, they said it opened the second sight. Modern scientists might call it an alteration of brain chemistry, but the ancients described it as seeing the world's true face for the first time. Imagine a world where every thought feels like a doorway and every memory reshapes itself as you reach for it. It's tempting to dismiss such visions as hallucinations, yet some philosophers argued that the waking world may be the true illusion. Plato once wrote that we live like prisoners, watching shadows dance upon a wall. But what if those shadows are more real than the world that casts them? What if the substance didn't create illusions, it peeled them away? Beneath the surface of perception, it is said, lies a deeper pattern, a rhythm that moves through everything. Some called it the pulse of the cosmos, others the whisper of the divine. In temples buried beneath sand and stone, initiates once drank from chalices that shimmered faintly in torchlight. Their eyes, witnesses claimed, seemed to lose their focus, gazing beyond the material world. When they returned, they spoke of geometry behind thought, of colors that hummed, and of time folding in on itself. To them, knowledge was never something learned, was remembered. Perhaps that is why so many myths speak not of discovery, but of rediscovery, as though truth is something our minds once knew and then forgot. Modern researchers might scoff, yet even they admit that memory is unreliable. Our pasts are stories rewritten each time we recall them. If a simple act of remembrance can alter the past within our minds, how stable is history itself? Could it be that civilizations once lived within entirely different states of awareness, worlds of meaning that vanished when perceptions shifted? A forgotten vibration, a missing frequency in the mind, and an entire chapter of human consciousness could be lost. Some fragments of text hint at this. They speak of the age of mirrors, when men and women saw two realities at once, the physical and the unseen. Then, abruptly, the age ended. Records became fragmented, language simplified. Symbols of vast complexity turned into shapes a child could draw. The cause, some said, was divine punishment. Others whispered that the substance itself had been sealed away, its knowledge deemed too dangerous for those who no longer understood. What fascinates philosophers is not whether these stories are true, but what they imply. If the human mind can shift so profoundly, then reality itself may not be a single, fixed truth, but a tapestry woven by perception. To change the pattern is to change existence, okay? And if that's so, then perhaps history isn't something that happened, but something we're still dreaming into being. The question then lingers: who or what first dreamed us? In meditation, monks sometimes describe the moment when thought dissolves and awareness observes itself. There's no sound, no image, only the stillness behind it all. Ancient mystics sought that stillness through ritual and rhythm. Modern seekers look for it in laboratories. Different paths, same yearning to peer behind the curtain of consciousness and glimpse the machinery of being. The substance was one such key, but like all keys, it demanded a price. To open one door meant closing another. Reports from explorers who dared to recreate ancient formulas describe sensations eerily similar to near-death experiences. The feeling of dissolving, merging with something vast, impersonal, yet deeply familiar. When they returned, they struggled to explain it. It wasn't a vision, one said. It was remembering what I am. That phrase echoes through centuries of mystic poetry and neuroscience alike. Remembering what we are, as if consciousness itself has amnesia. Perhaps that's why every age rediscovers the same questions under new names. Alchemists called it the prima materia, psychologists call it the subconscious, and physicists call it the quantum field. Different languages for the same unspeakable thing. We circle it endlessly, trying to describe what can only be felt. And sometimes that feeling is triggered not by words, but by contact with a substance, a sound, a symbol that loosens the knots in our perception. One might wonder if this pattern of awakening and forgetting is built into human history itself. Civilizations rise in bursts of brilliance, create wonders, then collapse into silence, leaving behind only symbols no one fully understands. Could it be that they reached too far into the mystery of the mind, glimpsed something that unravels meaning itself, and stepped back in fear? Or did they simply drift into another frequency of thought, one we no longer share? If we could see time not as a line, but as a spiral, we might recognize echoes, ages repeating, consciousness evolving in cycles. What we call progress may just be remembering in waves, each crest bringing back fragments of lost understanding. The substance, in this view, isn't merely a tool, it's a catalyst for memory on a cosmic scale. And if that's true, then every discovery we make may not be new at all, but a return to something ancient and deeply known. Yet, there's a gentle warning woven through these reflections. Knowledge that expands perception also exposes fragility. To see the machinery of reality is to realize how easily it could break. Perhaps that's why the ancients hid their formulas behind riddles and symbols, why they spoke in metaphor, not instruction. They knew that wisdom without balance can fracture the mind. Mystery is not meant to be solved, only approached with reverence. So we find ourselves here, between science and myth, reason and reverie, the mind as both explorer and landscape. We stare into the abyss of our own awareness, and sometimes it stares back not in hostility, but in invitation. The invitation to remember, to question, to wonder whether reality is something we inhabit or something we invent. And as that question lingers, a new one begins to take shape quietly, almost imperceptibly. If the mind can reshape the world, then what legacy has it already written into the fabric of time? What traces remain in our art, our faith, our very perception of being? The answer waits, just beyond the veil, and the next turning of the story where thought becomes history, and history becomes dream once more. Across centuries, whispers of the same idea resurface, sometimes in temples, sometimes in poems, sometimes in brushstrokes that seem to shimmer with meanings beyond their time. Different cultures, divided by oceans and languages, spoke of an essence that could awaken the sleeping parts of the soul. They gave it many names: the nectar of gods, the fruit of wisdom, the philosopher's dew. Yet beneath these names, there lingers the same quiet suggestion that human creativity, our art, and myth, and longing for transcendence might all be echoes of something we once tasted and then forgot. The stories never quite vanish. In Greece, poets told of ambrosia that granted divine insight rather than immortality. In India, the Vedic hymns sang of Soma, whose drinkers saw the dawns of the unseen. Among the Maya, carvings depict figures inhaling sacred vapors, their eyes half-lidded in what looks less like intoxication and more like revelation. Across these traditions, the theme repeats: knowledge and ecstasy intertwined, memory and creation inseparable. Could it be that the impulse to imagine, to dream, to reach for beauty beyond survival began with that altered state of mind? Consider the art that followed. In Renaissance paintings, halos glow like luminous orbs, not of sanctity, but perception itself, frames of expanded awareness. In Persian miniatures, the gardens teem with impossible colors, every leaf outlined as though trembling with secret energy. Even in medieval manuscripts, where monks illuminated letters with gold, the shimmering borders seem less decorative than symbolic, a reminder that meaning itself radiates when seen through different eyes. If the substance ever coursed through history, its traces might lie not in artifacts or ruins, but in the very evolution of human imagination. Literature, too, seems to hum with its memory. Dante's ascent to the celestial spheres, Blake's visions of fiery angels, Coleridge's opium-dreamed Kubla Khanal echoed the same yearning to glimpse the machinery behind existence. Their words read like transmissions from a realm half remembered, half feared. And while modern minds call them artists, the ancients might have called them initiates, those who saw too much and returned to translate their visions into human language. Yet there is something haunting in this lineage of inspiration. Many of these visionaries paid a price: madness, exile, obsession. They are the shadow twins of revelation. Perhaps the same substance that opens the gates of perception also loosens the bonds that keep us tethered to shared reality. Civilizations have always walked this delicate balance between revelation and ruin. When prophets begin to see differently, societies either follow or destroy them. And each time, the cycle begins anew. Knowledge revealed, knowledge suppressed, knowledge reborn in another form. Some scholars argue that even entire belief systems may have emerged from early encounters with altered consciousness. The gods who descend in light, the serpents that whisper secrets, the trees bearing forbidden fruit. What if these are metaphors for the mind itself expanding and fracturing under the influence of something powerful and unseen? The fall from paradise might not be moral at all, but perceptual. Humanity learning the cost of knowing too much. If this sounds far-fetched, one only has to look at how cultures treat those who claim to have seen beyond the veil. Shamans and mystics were once healers and guides, their altered states sacred. Later, the same visions were called delusion or heresy. The transformation from reverence to rejection reflects not a change in experience, but in societal comfort with mystery. We began to fear the unknown, to quarantine it in myth or madness, forgetting that it once guided our art, our rituals, even our sense of the divine. The hidden pattern becomes clearer the deeper we look. Whenever humanity brushes against the edges of consciousness, something extraordinary happens in culture. New philosophies arise. Language bends, explodes with symbols of transformation. The Renaissance, the Romantic era, the birth of modern science, all carried within them the spark of minds daring to perceive differently. Could it be coincidence, or the long echo of something still stirring within us, a memory of that primordial encounter with the unknown? Perhaps this is why the idea of the forbidden holds such power. We are drawn to what we are told to avoid, as though some buried part of us remembers that truth often hides behind warning signs. The substance's story, cloaked in taboo, may simply be a reflection of humanity's own divided heart-hearing, simultaneous yearning for enlightenment and fear of losing control. We suppress what we don't understand, only to rediscover it centuries later under a new name. Even in our time, the pattern repeats. Searchers studying the brain's mysterious chemistry speak in cautious tones, yet their language hints at awe. They describe neural circuits that light up like constellations, patterns of connectivity that mirror sacred geometry. Artists and thinkers once again gather in quiet corners of the world, seeking to awaken perception, not through superstition, but through disciplined curiosity. It feels as though history is circling back, bringing ancient wisdom into modern form. The substance, whatever its true nature, might never have left us. It simply changed its costume, hiding in metaphor, waiting for recognition. There's a strange comfort in that thought that the forbidden is not evil, but misunderstood. That what we call otherworldly may just be another layer of the same reality, glimpsed briefly when the mind is still. Each civilization, in its way, tried to translate that glimpse in songs, symbols, sacred rites. We inherit these fragments, like dreamers waking with only pieces of a vision. Yet those pieces, when fitted together, begin to form a picture too vast to ignore a pattern that suggests we have been chasing the same mystery since the beginning. And maybe that's the point. The substance, the visions, the myths, they are all mirrors, reflecting our endless attempt to know ourselves. The greatest secret may not lie in what the substance does, but in why we seek it. Beneath the chemistry and the ritual, there is a deeper impulse to remember what it means to be aware, to taste, for a moment, the boundary between creation and consciousness. So, when we look at the art on museum walls, or read the myths carved into forgotten stone, perhaps we are not just studying history, we are remembering it. Each image, each story, a soft echo of the same awakening that once rippled through human thought. And though we may no longer hold the chalice or inhale the sacred vapor, the essence remains within us, shaping dreams, guiding intuition, whispering across time that curiosity is both our greatest gift and our oldest temptation, because in the end, the story of the substance is not about chemistry or superstition. It is about us, the restless minds of a species forever poised between wonder and understanding. The substance merely offered a mirror, and we, staring into it, saw both the light and the shadow of what we might become. And as that reflection fades into the stillness of the next chapter, one truth lingers. What is forbidden is never truly forgotten. It waits, patient as memory, for the moment when humanity is ready to look again, to ask, not what it is, but what it reveals about the mystery of being. History has a way of whispering rather than speaking. Its truths are rarely declared, they flicker between the lines of what we think we know. The substance, once revered and then forbidden, might seem a relic of lost ages. Yet, when we look closely, the traces remain shadows of memory, stretching into the modern world. Could a forgotten drug still be quietly shaping the world around us today? In cities that never sleep, tucked between glass towers and glowing screens, there are circles of people who claim to pursue the original perception. They read the old texts, mix powders in secret, and speak of unlocking doors of memory buried in the collective mind. Two outsiders. These are eccentric dreamers, modern mystics, chasing illusions. But their language echoes that of priests and philosophers from millennia ago. They believe that ideas themselves are contagious, that the ancient substance didn't just alter bodies, it altered thought, and that alteration still pulses through humanity like an unseen current. The notion sounds fantastical, yet every era seems to rediscover it in some form. The 19th century called it the romantic imagination. The 20th spoke of psychedelia and expanded consciousness. Today, we speak of neuroplasticity, cognitive enhancement, and the search for flow. Different names, same hunger, to touch the invisible architecture of awareness. Perhaps the substance never truly disappeared, evolved, adapting its myth to each generation's language of progress. Even literature seems haunted by it. From Huxley's Doors of Perception to the cryptic allegories of Borges, there are stories that carry an unmistakable resonance, the suggestion that reality itself might be pliable, responsive to the states of mind that observe it. Some writers claim to have glimpsed something beneath the fabric of waking life, a pattern too intricate to invent, too familiar to deny. They described it as remembering a dream humanity once shared. That same dream runs through ancient hymns, secret societies, even the anonymous messages hidden in modern digital art. A code that never quite dies, only waits for someone who recognizes its pulse. And then there are the coincidences, the symbols of the old cults, the spiral, the eye. The Jalous keep reappearing in places that seem unrelated. Corporate logos, pop culture, architecture. Most dismiss it as coincidence, yet one cannot help but notice how the human psyche repeats itself, shaping forgotten truths into new symbols. Maybe these patterns persist because the substance left an imprint not on stone or parchment, but in the collective subconscious itself, a residue of awareness passed down like genetic memory. It isn't just art that carries the echo. Science, too, drifts closer to ancient ideas than it cares to admit. Quantum physicists describe observers shaping outcomes. Neuroscientists uncover brain states that mirror mystical experience. Historians quietly wonder whether early civilizations had knowledge we've only begun to rediscover in different terms. The boundaries between myth and research blur, and the forbidden begins to look like foresight. Perhaps what was once dismissed as superstition was, in truth, an early form of cognitive exploration, one we are only now beginning to map with microscopes and machines. Still, the mystery resists containment. Every time the world grows comfortable with reason, the irrational seeps back in dreams, synchronicities, visions that refuse to obey logic. The drug's legend survives there, in the cracks between certainty and imagination. Even the language of technology borrows its rhythm. We download, we upload, we connect and expand consciousness through digital realms. The metaphors have changed, but the longing remains the same. Humanity still wants to merge with something greater, still seeks the doorway the ancients once opened with smoke and song. In underground forums, one finds modern alchemists speaking of neural elixirs, not unlike the old initiates who guarded their recipes in coded verse. Some claim that with the right frequencies of light, sound, or chemistry, perception can be gently shifted toward that ancient clarity, lucid state where memory and imagination blend. Their experiments are fringe, yet oddly poetic, echoing the rituals of forgotten temples. It's as if the old spirit of inquiry, suppressed but never extinguished, keeps finding new vessels. Even mainstream culture seems drawn to this undercurrent. Films, music, and virtual worlds teemed with imagery of awakening and hidden realities. The hero drinks, inhales, plugs in, or takes the red pill. He awakens to a world beneath the world and realizes he was blind. These are not new stories. They are the same initiation myths retold in neon. The audience feels the thrill of recognition, as though the fiction is reminding them of something buried deep in the architecture of being. We watch entranced because some quiet part of us suspects it might be true. And what of power? Ever knowledge hides, power follows. Rumors persist of experiments, both governmental and private, designed to test how perception shapes behavior, how belief itself might be engineered. Said that fragments of the old formulas were recovered, studied, perhaps even synthesized under sterile lights. Officially, nothing came of it. Unofficially, whispers suggest otherwise. The same questions that haunted ancient priests now fascinate modern strategists. If consciousness can be tuned, can it also be controlled? What would a world look like where thought itself becomes territory? Most people never notice how these ideas slip quietly into public life. We speak casually of manifestation, of energy, of vibration. Once mystical language, now daily speech. The forbidden has become fashionable, its danger diluted, but its mystery intact. Yet, beneath the wellness slogans and self-help mantras, something older still hums, a distant echo of the same truth the ancients risked everything to touch. History never erases its secrets. It buries them under layers of translation, commerce, and distraction until they seem harmless, but they endure. Sometimes as a symbol on a ring, sometimes as a phrase in a poem, sometimes as a sudden, inexplicable moment of clarity when the world feels both utterly strange and profoundly familiar. The line between memory and myth blurs, and we find ourselves wondering whether the past ever really ended or whether it continues to dream through us. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the forgotten drug. Not a physical remnant, but a psychological seed. Every act of curiosity, every work of art that dares to question what is real, carries its echo. Humanity keeps trying to complete the same experiment, to understand itself through transformation. We may no longer gather in temples or carve visions into stone, but the same search moves through our circuitry, our art, our endless scroll of images glowing in the dark. And so, in every age, the question returns: what is reality, and who decides what it means to be awake? The answers keep shifting, but the longing remains the same, persistent as heartbeat, elusive as smoke. We chase it through science, through story, through the quiet hours of night when the world feels porous and the air hums with unseen presence. Maybe, just maybe, the substance was never meant to vanish. Maybe it transformed, became story, became us. And as we follow its trail through time, we realize that forgetting was never the opposite of remembering. It was the way history learned to hide what it could not destroy. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between dreaming and waking, certain questions seem to whisper louder. What truths will remain hidden forever, and which secrets are waiting for the next curious mind to discover? The story of the forgotten substance has wound through myth and science, faith and rebellion, revelation and ruin. Yet even now, as its traces fade into the folds of history, the echo remains subtle, persistent, impossible to silence. We have followed it across centuries, from the chalices of ancient initiates to the coded pages of alchemists, from the clandestine experiments of mystics to the sterile laboratories of modern minds. And in every age, it carried the same paradox. It offered knowledge, but demanded surrender. It's revealed, and in revealing, it concealed. Those who sought it found not answers, but reflections, glimpses of their own longing mirrored back through the lens of altered perception. The ancients called it sacred because they feared it. Modern seekers call it science because they hope to understand it. Yet, between those two impulses, fear and fascination, lies the essence of the human condition. Okay, we are creatures drawn to the edge of mystery, unable to resist peering into the dark. Okay? And perhaps that is why the substance has never truly vanished. Okay? It does not survive in form, but in the restless curiosity that drives us toward forbidden knowledge. It is tempting to imagine that we have moved beyond such myths, that reason has burned away the shadows. But even now, our world is haunted by the same desire to transcend limitation. We chase it through algorithms, through augmented realities, through pills that promise clarity and calm. The names have changed, but the yearning has not. We still seek the shortcut to understanding, the fast path to enlightenment, the modern sacrament. And like the ancients, we forget that every key can also be a lock, every revelation a burden. History is filled with cautionary tales, disguised as triumphs. Civilizations that reached too far into mystery often paid in silence. Temples collapsed, languages vanished, knowledge turned inward, encrypted in symbols that only the subconscious could read. Yet, in that loss lies the strange beauty of the human story. We forget, we rediscover, we forget again. Each cycle refining the same question: what does it mean to know? Perhaps the real danger of the substance was never physical. Perhaps its true risk lay in what it revealed about the fragility of perception itself. To realize that reality might bend with the mind is to recognize how easily it can shatter. Such understanding demands humility, a trait not often found in empires or institutions. Maybe that is why the guardians of power in every era have sought to suppress what they could not control. Forbidden knowledge is rarely destroyed because it is evil, but because it threatens the boundaries that keep order intact. Still, fragments endure. A line in a forgotten poem, a symbol etched on an amulet, a dream that feels too vivid to dismiss. These remnants remind us that mystery is not the enemy of truth, but its companion. Without the unknown, knowledge becomes stagnant in echo chamber of certainty. The forbidden drug, whatever its composition, stands as a metaphor for the one thing humanity can never outlaw: the desire to see beyond the visible. There's a strange comfort in knowing that the unknown still exists. In an age that measures everything, where even stars are cataloged and mapped, mystery remains our final frontier. The substance, in its elusive way, embodies that truth. It whispers that no matter how much we learn, the most profound discoveries may still lie within us, waiting for the right moment of stillness to be seen. Perhaps that is why, late at night, when the noise of the world subsides, we sense something ancient stirring, a quiet awareness that we have not yet reached the end of the story. But what of the warnings? Every revelation comes with its shadow. For some, the pursuit of the unknown becomes obsession, a hunger that devours meaning instead of expanding it. Many who sought the sacred insight lost themselves in the process, unable to return to ordinary life. The substance demanded reverence, patience, equilibrium. Without these, enlightenment curdled into madness. It is a reminder that curiosity must walk hand in hand with wisdom, that not every door should be opened simply because we can. And yet, how can we resist? The promise is too alluring: to glimpse the structure of existence, to feel time loosen its grip, to understand what consciousness truly is. Even those who deny the legends find themselves drawn to their echo. The mystery, after all, is not externally, lives in us. The drug may be forgotten, but the questions it raised remain urgent. What is the nature of thought? What is the boundary between dreaming and waking, between illusion and insight? If reality depends on perception, then whose perception shapes the world? No definitive answers survive, and perhaps none ever existed. The story of the substance teaches us that truth is not a destination, but a mirror reflection that changes as we do. Its legacy endures not as fact, but as invitation to look deeper, to think longer, to feel the weight of wonder before it slips away. The forbidden was never meant to be conquered. It was meant to remind us of how small and how infinite we are. So the tale ends, not with certainty, but with silence, the kind of silence that invites reflection rather than closure. Somewhere, a candle still burns in a forgotten library. Somewhere, a symbol carved into stone waits for eyes that can read it. And somewhere, perhaps in a dream, a voice whispers that the story is not over. It never was, because history does not end. It folds, recurs, awakens in new forms. The drug becomes an idea, the idea becomes a movement, and the movement becomes memory. Through art, through myth, through the flickering glow of our screens, the same question persists. How much of what we call reality is built upon what we choose not to see? In the end, we are left with only one durand, a choice. To turn away and sleep beneath the comfort of certainty, or to linger in the half-light, where truth hides just out of reach. The substance may have been forgotten, but the impulse it awakened curiosity itself endures. It is the quiet fire that has carried us through the ages, shaping every discovery, every story, every dream. And as the night deepens and the last words drift into stillness, teach, one thought remains. Perhaps the greatest secret of all is not what the substance revealed, but what it still conceals, the infinite depths of a consciousness that has only begun to remember itself.